War Department, Washington, April 27, 9:3 a.m. To Major General Dix. The department has received the following dispatch from Major General Halleck, commanding the Military Division of the James. Generals Canby and Thomas were instructed some days ago that Sherman's arrangements with Johnston were disapproved by the President, and they were ordered to disregard it and push the enemy in every direction. E.M. Stanton, Secretary of War. Richmond, Virginia, April 26, 9:30 p.m. Hun, E.M. Stanton, Secretary of War. Generals Meade, Sheridan, and Wright are acting under orders to pay no regard to any truce or orders of General Sherman respecting hostilities, on the ground that Sherman's agreement could bind his command only, and no other. They are directed to push forward, regardless of orders from anyone except from General Grant, and cut off Johnston's retreat. Beauregard has telegraphed to Danville that a new arrangement has been made with Sherman, and that the advance of the 6th Corps was to be suspended until further orders. I have telegraphed back to obey no orders of Sherman, but to push forward as rapidly as possible. The bankers here have information today that Jeff Davis's specie is moving south from Goldsboro, in wagons, as fast as possible. I suggest that orders be telegraphed through General Thomas that Wilson obey no orders from Sherman, and notifying him and Canby, and all commanders on the Mississippi, to take measures to intercept the rebel chiefs and their plunder. The specie taken with them is estimated here at from $6 to $13 million. H.W. Halleck, Major General Commanding. Subsequently, before the Committee on the Conduct of the War in Washington on the 22d of May, I testified fully on this whole matter, and will abide the judgment of the country on the patriotism and wisdom of my public conduct in this connection. General Halleck's measures to capture General Johnston's army, actually surrendered to me at the time, at Greensboro, on the 26th of April, simply excited my contempt for a judgment such as he was supposed to possess. The assertion that Jeff Davis's specie train of $6 to $13 million was reported to be moving south from Goldsboro, in wagons as fast as possible, found plenty of willing ears, though my army of 80,000 men had been at Goldsboro from March 22d to the date of his dispatch, April 26th. And such a train would have been composed of from 15 to 32 six-mule teams to have hauled this specie, even if it all were in gold. I suppose the exact amount of treasure which Davis had with him is now known to a cent. Some of it was paid to his escort, when it disbanded at and near Washington, Georgia, and at the time of his capture he had a small parcel of gold and silver coin, not to exceed $10,000, which is now retained in the United States Treasury Vault at Washington and shown to the curious. The 13 millions of treasure, with which Jeff Davis was to corrupt our armies and buy his escape, dwindled down to the contents of a hand valise. To say that I was merely angry at the tone and substance of these published bulletins of the War Department would hardly express the state of my feelings. I was outraged beyond measure, and was resolved to resent the insult, cost what it might. I went to the Wayanda and showed them to Mr. Chase, with whom I had a long and frank conversation, during which he explained to me the confusion caused in Washington by the assassination of Mr. Lincoln, the sudden accession to power of Mr. Johnson, who was then supposed to be bitter and vindictive in his feelings toward the South, and the wild pressure of every class of politicians to enforce on the new president their pet schemes. He showed me a letter of his own, which was in print, dated Baltimore, April 11th, and another of April 12th, addressed to the president, urging him to recognize the freedmen as equal in all respects to the whites. He was the first man, of any authority or station, who ever informed me that the government of the United States would insist on extending to the former slaves of the South the elective franchise, and he gave as a reason the fact that the slaves, grateful for their freedom, for which they were indebted to the armies and government of the North, would, by their votes, offset the disaffected and rebel element of the white population of the South. At that time quite a storm was prevailing at sea outside, and our two vessels lay snug at the wharf at Morehead City. I saw a good deal of Mr. Chase, and several notes passed between us, of which I have the originals yet. Always claiming that the South had herself freed all her slaves by rebellion, and that Mr. Lincoln's proclamation of freedom, of September 22, 1862, was binding on all officers of the general government. I doubted the wisdom of at once clothing them with the elective franchise without some previous preparation and qualification, and then realized the national loss in the death at that critical moment of Mr. Lincoln, who had long pondered over the difficult questions involved, who, at all events, would have been honest and frank, and would not have withheld from his army commanders at least a hint that would have been to them a guide. It was plain to me, therefore, that the manner of his assassination had stampeded the civil authorities in Washington, had unnerved them, and that they were then undecided as to the measures indispensably necessary to prevent anarchy at the South. On the 7th of May, the storm subsided, and we put to sea, Mr. Chase to the south, on his proposed tour as far as New Orleans, and I for James River. I reached Fortress Monroe on the 8th, and thence telegraphed my arrival to General Grant, asking for orders. I found at Fortress Monroe a dispatch from General Halleck professing great friendship and inviting me to accept his hospitality at Richmond. I answered by a cipher dispatch that I had seen his dispatch to Mr. Stanton of April 26th, embraced in the second bulletin, which I regarded as insulting, declined his hospitality, and added that I preferred we should not meet as I passed through Richmond. I thence proceeded to City Point in the Russia, and on to Manchester, opposite Richmond, via Petersburg, by rail. I found that both wings of the army had arrived from Raleigh and were in camp in and around Manchester, whence I again telegraphed General Grant, and the 9th of May, for orders, and also reported my arrival to General Halleck by letter. I found that General Halleck had ordered General Davis's corps, the 14th, for review by himself. This I forbade. All the army knew of the insult that had been made me by the Secretary of War and General Halleck, and watched me closely to see if I would tamely submit. During the 9th, I made a full and complete report of all these events, from the last report made at Goldsboro, up to date, and the next day received orders to continue the march to Alexandria, near Washington. On the morning of the 11th, we crossed the pontoon bridge at Richmond, marched through that city, and out on the Hanover Courthouse Road, General Slockham's left wing leading. The right wing, General Logan, followed the next day, viz., the 12th. Meantime, General O. Howard had been summoned to Washington to take charge of the new Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. And from that time till the army was finally disbanded, General John A. Logan was in command of the right wing and of the Army of the Tennessee. The left wing marched through Hanover Courthouse, and thence took roads well to the left by Charlesburg, the 14th Corps by New Market and Culpeper, Manassas, etc., the 20th Corps by Spotsylvania Courthouse and Chancellorsville. The right wing followed the more direct road by Fredericksburg. On my way north I endeavored to see as much of the battlefields of the Army of the Potomac as I could, and therefore shifted from one column to the other, visiting en route Hanover Courthouse, Spotsylvania, Fredericksburg, Dumfries, etc., reaching Alexandria during the afternoon of May 19th, and pitched my camp by the roadside, about halfway between Alexandria and the Long Bridge. During the same and next day, the whole army reached Alexandria and camped round about it. General Meade's Army of the Potomac had possession of the camps above, opposite Washington and Georgetown. The next day, by invitation, I went over to Washington and met many friends, among them General Grant and President Johnson. The latter occupied rooms in the house on the corner of 15th and H Streets, belonging to Mr. Hooper. He was extremely cordial to me, and knowing that I was chafing under the censures of the War Department, especially of the 2 war bulletins of Mr. Stanton, he volunteered to say that he knew of neither of them till seen in the newspapers, and that Mr. Stanton had shown neither to him nor to any of his associates in the cabinet till they were published. Nearly all the members of the cabinet made similar assurances to me afterward, and, as Mr. Stanton made no friendly advances and offered no word of explanation or apology, I declined General Grant's friendly offices for a reconciliation, but, on the contrary, resolved to resent what I considered an insult, as publicly as it was made. My brother, Senator Sherman, who was Mr. Stanton's neighbor, always insisted that Mr. Stanton had been frightened by the intended assassination of himself and had become embittered thereby. At all events, I found strong military guards around his house, as well as all the houses occupied by the cabinet and by the principal officers of government, and a sense of insecurity pervaded Washington, for which no reason existed. On the 19th, I received a copy of War Department Special Order No. 239, Adjutant General's Office of May 18th, ordering a grand review by the President and Cabinet of all the armies then near Washington. General Meade's to occur on Tuesday, May 23d, mine on Wednesday, the 24th, and on the 20th I made the necessary orders for my part. Meantime I had also arranged, with General Grant's approval, to remove after the review my armies from the south side of the Potomac to the north, both for convenience and because our men had found that the grounds assigned them had been used so long for camps that they were foul and unfit. By invitation, I was on the reviewing stand and witnessed the review of the Army of the Potomac on the 23d, commanded by General Meade in person. The day was beautiful and the pageant was superb. Washington was full of strangers, who filled the streets in holiday dress, and every house was decorated with flags. The army marched by divisions in close column around the Capitol, down Pennsylvania Avenue, past the President and Cabinet, who occupied a large stand prepared for the occasion, directly in front of the White House. I had telegraphed to Lancaster for Mrs. Sherman, who arrived that day, accompanied by her father, the Hun, Thomas Ewing, and my son Tom, then 8 years old. During the afternoon and night of the 23d, the 15th, 17th, and 20th Corps crossed Long Bridge, bivouacked in the streets about the Capitol, and the 14th Corps closed up to the bridge. The morning of the 24th was extremely beautiful, and the ground was in splendid order for our review. The streets were filled with people to see the pageant, armed with bouquets of flowers for their favorite regiments or heroes, and everything was propitious. Punctually at 9 a.m., the signal gun was fired, when in person, attended by General Howard and all my staff, I rode slowly down Pennsylvania Avenue, the crowds of men, women, and children densely lining the sidewalks and almost obstructing the way. We were followed close by General Logan and the head of the 15th Corps. When I reached the Treasury Building and looked back, the sight was simply magnificent. The column was compact, and the glittering muskets looked like a solid mass of steel, moving with the regularity of a pendulum. We passed the Treasury Building, in front of which and of the White House was an immense throng of people, for whom extensive stands had been prepared on both sides of the avenue. As I neared the brick house opposite the lower corner of Lafayette Square, someone asked me to notice Mr. Seward, who, still feeble and bandaged for his wounds, had been removed there that he might behold the troops. I moved in that direction and took off my hat to Mr. Seward, who sat at an upper window. He recognized the salute, returned it, and then we rode on steadily past the President, saluting with our swords. All on his stand arose and acknowledged the salute. Then, turning into the gate of the presidential grounds, we left our horses with orderlies and went upon the stand, where I found Mrs. Sherman with her father and son. Passing them, I shook hands with the President, General Grant, and each member of the cabinet. As I approached Mr. Stanton, he offered me his hand, but I declined it publicly, and the fact was universally noticed. I then took my post on the left of the President, and for 6 hours and a half stood, while the army passed in the order of the 15th, 17th, 20th, and 14th Corps. It was, in my judgment, the most magnificent army in existence, 65,000 men, in splendid physique, who had just completed a march of nearly 2,000 miles in a hostile country, in good drill, and who realized that they were being closely scrutinized by thousands of their fellow countrymen and by foreigners. Division after division passed, each commander of an army corps or division coming on the stand during the passage of his command, to be presented to the President, Cabinet, and spectators. The steadiness and firmness of the tread, the careful dress on the guides, the uniform intervals between the companies, all eyes directly to the front, and the tattered and bullet-ridden flags, festooned with flowers, all attracted universal notice. Many good people, up to that time, had looked upon our Western army as a sort of mob, but the world then saw and recognized the fact that it was an army in the proper sense, well organized, well commanded, and disciplined, and there was no wonder that it had swept through the South like a tornado. For 6 hours and a half, that strong tread of the Army of the West resounded along Pennsylvania Avenue. Not a soul of that vast crowd of spectators left his place. And when the rear of the column had passed by, thousands of the spectators still lingered to express their sense of confidence in the strength of a government which could claim such an army. Some little scenes enlivened the day and called for the laughter and cheers of the crowd. Each division was followed by 6 ambulances as a representative of its baggage train. Some of the division commanders had added, by way of variety, goats, milch cows, and pack mules, whose loads consisted of gamecocks, poultry, hams, etc., and some of them had the families of freed slaves along, with the women leading their children. Each division was preceded by its corps of black pioneers, armed with picks and spades. These marched abreast in double ranks, keeping perfect dress and step, and added much to the interest of the occasion. On the whole, the Grand Review was a splendid success, and was a fitting conclusion to the campaign and the war. I will now conclude by a copy of my general orders taking leave of the army, which ended my connection with the war, though I afterward visited and took a more formal leave of the officers and men on July 4, 1865, at Louisville, Kentucky. Headquarters Military Division of the Mississippi. In the field, Washington, D.C., May 30, 1865. The general commanding announces to the armies of the Tennessee and Georgia that the time has come for us to part. Our work is done, and armed enemies no longer defy us. Some of you will go to your homes, and others will be retained in military service till further orders. And now that we are all about to separate, to mingle with the civil world, it becomes a pleasing duty to recall to mind the situation of national affairs, when, but little more than a year ago, we were gathered about the cliffs of Lookout Mountain, and all the future was wrapped in doubt and uncertainty. 3 armies had come together from distant fields, with separate histories, yet bound by one common cause, the union of our country and the perpetuation of the government of our inheritance. There is no need to recall to your memories Tunnel Hill, with Rocky Face Mountain and Buzzard Roost Gap, and the ugly forts of Dalton behind. We were in earnest, and paused not for danger and difficulty, but dashed through Snake Creek Gap and fell on Resaca, then on to the Etowah, to Dallas, Kennesaw, and the heats of summer found us on the banks of the Chattahoochee, far from home and dependent on a single road for supplies. Again, we were not to be held back by any obstacle, and crossed over and fought 4 hard battles for the possession of the citadel of Atlanta. That was the crisis of our history. A doubt still clouded our future, but we solved the problem, destroyed Atlanta, struck boldly across the state of Georgia, severed all the main arteries of life to our enemy, and Christmas found us at Savannah. Waiting there only long enough to fill our wagons, we again began a march which, for peril, labor, and results, will compare with any ever made by an organized army. The floods of the Savannah, the swamps of the Combahee and Edisto, the high hills and rocks of the Santee, the flat quagmires of the Petty and Cape Fear rivers were all passed in midwinter, with its floods and rains, in the face of an accumulating enemy. And after the battles of Averasboro and Bentonsville, we once more came out of the wilderness, to meet our friends at Goldsboro. Even then we paused only long enough to get new clothing, to reload our wagons, again pushed on to Raleigh and beyond, until we met our enemy suing for peace instead of war, and offering to submit to the injured laws of his and our country. As long as that enemy was defiant, nor mountains, nor rivers, nor swamps, nor hunger, nor cold had checked us. But when he, who had fought us hard and persistently, offered submission, your general thought it wrong to pursue him farther, and negotiations followed, which resulted, as you all know, in his surrender. How far the operations of this army contributed to the final overthrow of the Confederacy and the peace which now dawns upon us, must be judged by others, not by us. But that you have done all that men could do has been admitted by those in authority, and we have a right to join in the universal joy that fills our land because the war is over, and our government stands vindicated before the world by the joint action of the volunteer armies and Navy of the United States. To such as remain in the service, your general need only remind you that success in the past was due to hard work and discipline, and that the same work and discipline are equally important in the future. To such as go home, he will only say that our favored country is so grand, so extensive, so diversified in climate, soil, and productions that every man may find a home and occupation suited to his taste. None should yield to the natural impatience sure to result from our past life of excitement and adventure. You will be invited to seek new adventures abroad. Do not yield to the temptation, for it will lead only to death and disappointment. Your general now bids you farewell, with the full belief that, as in war you have been good soldiers, so in peace you will make good citizens. And if, unfortunately, new war should arise in our country, Sherman's army will be the first to buckle on its old armor and come forth to defend and maintain the government of our inheritance. By order of Major General W.T. Sherman. L.M. Dayton, Assistant Adjutant General. List of the average number of miles marched by the different Army Corps of the United States forces under command of Major General W.T. Sherman, United States Army, during his campaigns: 1863-64-65, THTHTHTHTHTH Corps. Miles: 110,586, 289,076, 525. Chapter 25. Conclusion: Military Lessons of the War. Having thus recorded a summary of events, mostly under my own personal supervision, during the years from 1846 to 1865, it seems proper that I should add an opinion of some of the useful military lessons to be derived therefrom. That Civil War, by reason of the existence of slavery, was apprehended by most of the leading statesmen of the half-century preceding its outbreak, is a matter of notoriety. General Scott told me on my arrival at New York as early as 1850 that the country was on the eve of civil war, and the Southern politicians openly asserted that it was their purpose to accept as a casus belli the election of General Fremont in 1856. But fortunately or unfortunately, he was beaten by Mr. Buchanan, which simply postponed its occurrence for 4 years. Mr. Seward had also publicly declared that no government could possibly exist half slave and half free. Yet the government made no military preparation, and the Northern people generally paid no attention, took no warning of its coming, and would not realize its existence till Fort Sumter was fired on by batteries of artillery, handled by declared enemies, from the surrounding islands and from the city of Charleston. General Bragg, who certainly was a man of intelligence, and who, in early life, ridiculed 1,000 times, in my hearing, the threats of the people of South Carolina to secede from the Federal Union, said to me in New Orleans, in February 1861, that he was convinced that the feeling between the slave and free states had become so embittered that it was better to part in peace, better to part anyhow. And, as a separation was inevitable, that the South should begin at once, because the possibility of a successful effort was yearly lessened by the rapid and increasing inequality between the two sections, from the fact that all the European immigrants were coming to the northern states and territories, and none to the southern. The slave population M. 1860 was near 4 millions, and the money value thereof not far from $2,500 million. Now, ignoring the moral side of the question, a cause that endangered so vast a moneyed interest was an adequate cause of anxiety and preparation, and the Northern leaders surely ought to have foreseen the danger and prepared for it. After the election of Mr. Lincoln in 1860, there was no concealment of the declaration and preparation for war in the South. In Louisiana, as I have related, men were openly enlisted, officers were appointed, and war was actually begun in January 1861. The forts at the mouth of the Mississippi were seized and occupied by garrisons that hauled down the United States flag and hoisted that of the state. The United States arsenal at Baton Rouge was captured by New Orleans militia, its garrison ignominiously sent off, and the contents of the arsenal distributed. These were as much acts of war as was the subsequent firing on Fort Sumter, yet no public notice was taken thereof, and when, months afterward, I came north, I found not one single sign of preparation. It was for this reason, somewhat, that the people of the South became convinced that those of the North were pusillanimous and cowardly, and the Southern leaders were thereby enabled to commit their people to the war, nominally in defense of their slave property. Up to the hour of the firing on Fort Sumter, in April 1861, it does seem to me that our public men, our politicians, were blamable for not sounding the note of alarm. Then, when war was actually begun, it was by a call for 75,000 90-day men. I suppose to fulfill Mr. Seward's prophecy that the war would last but 90 days. The earlier steps by our political government were extremely wavering and weak, for which an excuse can be found in the fact that many of the Southern representatives remained in Congress, sharing in the public councils, and influencing legislation. But as soon as Mr. Lincoln was installed, there was no longer any reason why Congress and the cabinet should have hesitated. They should have measured the cause, provided the means, and left the executive to apply the remedy. At the time of Mr. Lincoln's inauguration, viz., March 4, 1861, the regular army, by law, consisted of 2 regiments of dragoons, 2 regiments of cavalry, 1 regiment of mounted rifles, 4 regiments of artillery, and 10 regiments of infantry, admitting of an aggregate strength of 13,024 officers and men. On the subsequent 4th of May, the President, by his own orders afterwards sanctioned by Congress, added a regiment of cavalry, a regiment of artillery, and 8 regiments of infantry, which, with the former army, admitted of a strength of 39,973. But at no time during the war did the regular army attain a strength of 25,000 men. To the new regiments of infantry was given an organization differing from any that had heretofore prevailed in this country of 3 battalions of 8 companies each. But at no time did more than one of these regiments attain its full standard. Nor in the vast army of volunteers that was raised during the war were any of the regiments of infantry formed on the 3-battalion system, but these were universally single battalions of 10 companies. So that, on the reorganization of the regular army at the close of the war, Congress adopted the form of 12 companies for the regiments of cavalry and artillery, and that of 10 companies for the infantry, which is the present standard. Inasmuch as the regular army will naturally form the standard of organization for any increase or for new regiments of volunteers, it becomes important to study this subject in the light of past experience, and to select that form which is best for peace as well as war. A cavalry regiment is now composed of 12 companies, usually divided into 6 squadrons, of 2 companies each, or better subdivided into 3 battalions of 4 companies each. This is an excellent form, easily admitting of subdivision as well as union into larger masses. A single battalion of 4 companies with a field officer will compose a good body for a garrison, for a separate expedition, or for a detachment. And in war, 3 regiments would compose a good brigade, 3 brigades a division, and 3 divisions a strong cavalry corps, such as was formed and fought by Generals Sheridan and Wilson during the war. In the artillery arm, the officers differ widely in their opinion of the true organization. A single company forms a battery, and habitually each battery acts separately, though sometimes several are united or massed, but these always act in concert with cavalry or infantry. Nevertheless, the regimental organization for artillery has always been maintained in this country for classification and promotion. 12 companies compose a regiment, and though probably no colonel ever commanded his full regiment in the form of 12 batteries, yet in peace they occupy our heavy seacoast forts or act as infantry. Then the regimental organization is both necessary and convenient. But the infantry composes the great mass of all armies, and the true form of the regiment or unit has been the subject of infinite discussion. And, as I have stated, during the Civil War the regiment was a single battalion of 10 companies. In olden times, the regiment was composed of 8 battalion companies and 2 flank companies. The 1st and 10th companies were armed with rifles and were styled and used as skirmishers. But during the war, they were never used exclusively for that special purpose, and in fact, no distinction existed between them and the other 8 companies. The 10-company organization is awkward in practice, and I am satisfied that the infantry regiment should have the same identical organization as exists for the cavalry and artillery, viz., 12 companies, so as to be susceptible of division into 3 battalions of 4 companies each. These companies should habitually be about 101 men strong, giving 1,200 to a regiment, which in practice would settle down to about 1,000 men. 3 such regiments would compose a brigade, 3 brigades a division, and 3 divisions a corps. Then, by allowing to an infantry corps a brigade of cavalry and 6 batteries of field artillery, we would have an efficient corps d'armée of 30,000 men, whose organization would be simple and most efficient, and whose strength should never be allowed to fall below 25,000 men. The corps is the true unit for grand campaigns and battle, should have a full and perfect staff and everything requisite for separate action, ready at all times to be detached and sent off for any nature of service. The general in command should have the rank of lieutenant general and should be, by experience and education, equal to anything in war. Habitually with us he was a major general, specially selected and assigned to the command by an order of the president, constituting, in fact, a separate grade. The division is the unit of administration and is the legitimate command of a major general. The brigade is the next subdivision and is commanded by a brigadier general. The regiment is the family. The colonel, as the father, should have a personal acquaintance with every officer and man and should instill a feeling of pride and affection for himself, so that his officers and men would naturally look to him for personal advice and instruction. In war, the regiment should never be subdivided, but should always be maintained entire. In peace, this is impossible. The company is the true unit of discipline, and the captain is the company. A good captain makes a good company, and he should have the power to reward as well as punish. The fact that soldiers' world naturally like to have a good fellow for their captain is the best reason why he should be appointed by the colonel or by some superior authority instead of being elected by the men. In the United States, the people are the sovereign. All power originally proceeds from them, and therefore the election of officers by the men is the common rule. This is wrong because an army is not a popular organization, but an animated machine, an instrument in the hands of the executive for enforcing the law and maintaining the honor and dignity of the nation. And the president, as the constitutional commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy, should exercise the power of appointment, subject to the confirmation of the Senate of the officers of volunteers, as well as of regulars. No army can be efficient unless it be a unit for action, and the power must come from above, not from below. The president usually delegates his power to the commander-in-chief, and he to the next, and so on down to the lowest actual commander of troops, however small the detachment. No matter how troops come together, when once united, the highest officer in rank is held responsible, and should be consequently armed with the fullest power of the executive, subject only to law and existing orders. The more simple the principle, the greater the likelihood of determined action. And the less a commanding officer is circumscribed by bounds or by precedent, the greater is the probability that he will make the best use of his command and achieve the best results. The regular army and the military academy at West Point have in the past provided, and doubtless will in the future provide an ample supply of good officers for future wars. But should their numbers be insufficient, we can always safely rely on the great number of young men of education and force of character throughout the country to supplement them. At the close of our Civil War, lasting 4 years, some of our best corps and division generals, as well as staff officers, were from civil life. But I cannot recall any of the most successful who did not express a regret that he had not received in early life instruction in the elementary principles of the art of war, instead of being forced to acquire this knowledge in the dangerous and expensive school of actual war. But the vital difficulty was, and will be again, to obtain an adequate number of good soldiers. We tried almost every system known to modern nations, all with more or less success: voluntary enlistments, the draft, and bought substitutes, and I think that all officers of experience will confirm my assertion that the men who voluntarily enlisted at the outbreak of the war were the best, better than the conscript, and far better than the bought substitute. When a regiment is once organized in a state and mustered into the service of the United States, the officers and men become subject to the same laws of discipline and government as the regular troops. They are in no sense militia, but compose a part of the Army of the United States, only retain their state title for convenience, and yet may be principally recruited from the neighborhood of their original organization. Once organized, the regiment should be kept full by recruits, and when it becomes difficult to obtain more recruits, the pay should be raised by Congress, instead of tempting new men by exaggerated bounties. I believe it would have been more economical to have raised the pay of the soldier to $30 or even $50 a month than to have held out the promise of $300 and even $600 in the form of bounty. Toward the close of the war, I have often heard the soldiers complain that the stay-at-home men got better pay, bounties, and food than they who were exposed to all the dangers and vicissitudes of the battles and marches at the front. The feeling of the soldier should be that, in every event, the sympathy and preference of his government is for him who fights rather than for him who is on provost or guard duty to the rear, and like most men, he measures this by the amount of pay. Of course, the soldier must be trained to obedience and should be content with his wages. But whoever has commanded an army in the field knows the difference between a willing, contented mass of men and one that feels a cause of grievance. There is a soul to an army as well as to the individual man, and no general can accomplish the full work of his army unless he commands the soul of his men, as well as their bodies and legs. The greatest mistake made in our Civil War was in the mode of recruitment and promotion. When a regiment became reduced by the necessary wear and tear of service, instead of being filled up at the bottom, and the vacancies among the officers filled from the best non-commissioned officers and men, the habit was to raise new regiments, with new colonels, captains, and men, leaving the old and experienced battalions to dwindle away into mere skeleton organizations. I believe with the volunteers, this matter was left to the states exclusively, and I remember that Wisconsin kept her regiments filled with recruits, whereas other states generally filled their quotas by new regiments, and the result was that we estimated a Wisconsin regiment equal to an ordinary brigade. I believe that 500 new men added to an old and experienced regiment were more valuable than 1,000 men in the form of a new regiment, for the former by association with good, experienced captains, lieutenants, and non-commissioned officers, soon became veterans, whereas the latter were generally unavailable for a year. The German method of recruitment is simply perfect, and there is no good reason why we should not follow it substantially. On a road marching by the flank, it would be considered good order to have 5,000 men to a mile, so that a full corps of 30,000 men would extend 6 miles. But with the average trains and batteries of artillery, the probabilities are that it would draw out to 10 miles. On a long and regular march, the divisions and brigades should alternate in the lead. The leading division should be on the road by the earliest dawn and march at the rate of about 2 miles, or, at most, 2.5 miles an hour, so as to reach camp by noon. Even then, the rear divisions and trains will hardly reach camp much before night. Theoretically, a marching column should preserve such order that by simply halting and facing to the right or left, it would be in line of battle. But this is rarely the case, and generally deployments are made forward, by conducting each brigade by the flank obliquely to the right or left to its approximate position in line of battle, and there deployed. In such a line of battle, a brigade of 3,000 infantry would occupy a mile of front. But for a strong line of battle, 5,000 men with 2 batteries should be allowed to each mile, or a division would habitually constitute a double line with skirmishers and a reserve on a mile of front. The feeding of an army is a matter of the most vital importance and demands the earliest attention of the general entrusted with a campaign. To be strong, healthy, and capable of the largest measure of physical effort, the soldier needs about 3 pounds gross of food per day, and the horse or mule about 20 pounds. When a general first estimates the quantity of food and forage needed for an army of 50 or 100,000 men, he is apt to be dismayed, and here a good staff is indispensable, though the general cannot throw off on them the responsibility. He must give the subject his personal attention, for the army reposes in him alone, and should never doubt the fact that their existence overrides in importance all other considerations. Once satisfied of this, and that all has been done that can be, the soldiers are always willing to bear the largest measure of privation. Probably no army ever had a more varied experience in this regard than the one I commanded in 186,465. Our base of supply was at Nashville, supplied by railways and the Cumberland River, thence by rail to Chattanooga, a secondary base, and thence forward a single-track railroad. The stores came forward daily, but I endeavored to have on hand a full supply for 20 days in advance. These stores were habitually in the wagon trains, distributed to corps, divisions, and regiments, in charge of experienced quartermasters and commissaries, and became subject to the orders of the generals commanding these bodies. They were generally issued on provision returns, but these had to be closely scrutinized, for too often the colonels would make requisitions for provisions for more men than they reported for battle. Of course, there are always a good many non-combatants with an army, but after careful study, I limited their amount to 25% of the effective strength, and that was found to be liberal. An ordinary army wagon drawn by 6 mules may be counted on to carry 3,000 pounds net, equal to the food of a full regiment for one day, but by driving along beef cattle, a commissary may safely count the contents of one wagon as sufficient for 2 days' food for a regiment of 1,000 men. And as a corps should have food on hand for 20 days ready for detachment, it should have 300 such wagons, as a provision train. And for forage, ammunition, clothing, and other necessary stores, it was found necessary to have 300 more wagons, or 600 wagons in all, for a corps d'armée. These should be absolutely under the immediate control of the corps commander, who will, however, find it economical to distribute them in due proportion to his divisions, brigades, and even regiments. Each regiment ought usually to have at least one wagon for convenience to distribute stores, and each company 2 pack mules, so that the regiment may always be certain of a meal on reaching camp without waiting for the larger trains. On long marches, the artillery and wagon trains should always have the right of way, and the troops should improvise roads to one side, unless forced to use a bridge in common, and all trains should have escorts to protect them and to assist them in bad places. To this end, there is nothing like actual experience, only, unless the officers in command give the subject their personal attention, they will find their wagon trains loaded down with tents, personal baggage, and even the arms and knapsacks of the escort. Each soldier should, if not actually sick or wounded, carry his musket and equipments containing from 40 to 60 rounds of ammunition, his shelter tent, a blanket or overcoat, and an extra pair of pants, socks, and drawers, in the form of a scarf, worn from the left shoulder to the right side in lieu of knapsack. And in his haversack he should carry some bread, cooked meat, salt, and coffee. I do not believe a soldier should be loaded down too much, but including his clothing, arms, and equipment, he can carry about 50 pounds without impairing his health or activity. A simple calculation will show that by such a distribution a corps will thus carry the equivalent of 500 wagon loads in immense relief to the trains. Where an army is near one of our many large navigable rivers, or has the safe use of a railway, it can usually be supplied with the full army ration, which is by far the best furnished to any army in America or Europe. But when it is compelled to operate away from such a base, and is dependent on its own train of wagons, the commanding officer must exercise a wise discretion in the selection of his stores. In my opinion, there is no better food for man than beef cattle driven on the hoof, issued liberally, with salt, bacon, and bread. Coffee has also become almost indispensable, though many substitutes were found for it, such as Indian corn, roasted, ground, and boiled as coffee, the sweet potato, and the seed of the okra plant prepared in the same way. All these were used by the people of the South, who for years could procure no coffee, but I noticed that the women always begged of us some real coffee, which seems to satisfy a natural yearning or craving more powerful than can be accounted for on the theory of habit. Therefore, I would always advise that the coffee and sugar ration be carried along, even at the expense of bread, for which there are many substitutes. Of these, Indian corn is the best and most abundant. Parched in a frying pan, it is excellent food, or if ground or pounded and boiled with meat of any sort, it makes a most nutritious meal. The potato, both Irish and sweet, forms an excellent substitute for bread, and at Savannah we found that rice was also suitable, both for men and animals. For the former, it should be cleaned of its husk in a hominy block, easily prepared out of a log, and sifted with a coarse corn bag, but for horses it should be fed in the straw. During the Atlanta campaign, we were supplied by our regular commissaries with all sorts of patent compounds, such as desiccated vegetables, and concentrated milk, meat biscuit, and sausages. But somehow the men preferred the simpler and more familiar forms of food, and usually styled these desecrated vegetables and consecrated milk. We were also supplied liberally with lime juice, sauerkraut, and pickles as an antidote to scurvy, and I now recall the extreme anxiety of my medical director, Dr. Kitto, about the scurvy, which he reported at one time as spreading and imperiling the army. This occurred at a crisis about Kennesaw, when the railroad was taxed to its utmost capacity to provide the necessary ammunition, food, and forage, and could not possibly bring us an adequate supply of potatoes and cabbage, the usual anti-scorbutics, when providentially the blackberries ripened and proved an admirable antidote. And I have known the skirmish line, without orders, to fight a respectable battle for the possession of some old fields that were full of blackberries. Soon thereafter, the green corn or roasting ear came into season, and I heard no more of the scurvy. Our country abounds with plants which can be utilized for a prevention to the scurvy. Besides the above are the persimmon, the sassafras root and bud, the wild mustard, the agave, turnip tops, the dandelion cooked as greens, and a decoction of the ordinary pine leaf. For the more delicate and costly articles of food for the sick, we relied mostly on the agents of the Sanitary Commission. I do not wish to doubt the value of these organizations, which gained so much applause during our Civil War, for no one can question the motives of these charitable and generous people. But to be honest, I must record an opinion that the Sanitary Commission should limit its operations to the hospitals at the rear, and should never appear at the front. They were generally local in feeling, aimed to furnish their personal friends and neighbors with a better class of food than the government supplied, and the consequence was that one regiment of a brigade would receive potatoes and fruit which would be denied another regiment close by. Jealousy would be the inevitable result, and in an army all parts should be equal. There should be no partiality, favor, or affection. The government should supply all essential wants, and in the hospitals to the rear will be found abundant opportunities for the exercise of all possible charity and generosity. During the war, I several times gained the ill will of the agents of the Sanitary Commission, because I forbade their coming to the front unless they would consent to distribute their stores equally among all, regardless of the parties who had contributed them. The sick, wounded, and dead of an army are the subjects of the greatest possible anxiety, and add an immense amount of labor to the well men. Each regiment in an active campaign should have a surgeon and 2 assistants always close at hand, and each brigade and division should have an experienced surgeon as a medical director. The great majority of wounds and of sickness should be treated by the regimental surgeon, on the ground, under the eye of the colonel. As few should be sent to the brigade or division hospital as possible, for the men always receive better care with their own regiment than with strangers, and as a rule the cure is more certain. But when men receive disabling wounds, or have sickness likely to become permanent, the sooner they go far to the rear the better for all. The tent or the shelter of a tree is a better hospital than a house, whose walls absorb fetid and poisonous emanations and then give them back to the atmosphere. To men accustomed to the open air, who live on the plainest food, wounds seem to give less pain, and are attended with less danger to life than to ordinary soldiers in barracks. Wounds which, in 1861, would have sent a man to the hospital for months, in 1865 were regarded as mere scratches, rather the subject of a joke than of sorrow. To new soldiers, the sight of blood and death always has a sickening effect, but soon men become accustomed to it, and I have heard them exclaim on seeing a dead comrade borne to the rear, "Well, Bill has turned up his toes to the daisies." Of course, during a skirmish or battle, armed men should never leave their ranks to attend a dead or wounded comrade. This should be seen to in advance by the colonel, who should designate his musicians or company cooks as hospital attendants, with a white rag on their arm to indicate their office. A wounded man should go himself, if able, to the surgeon near at hand, or, if he need help, he should receive it from one of the attendants and not a comrade. It is wonderful how soon the men accustom themselves to these simple rules. In great battles, these matters call for a more enlarged attention, and then it becomes the duty of the division general to see that proper stretchers and field hospitals are ready for the wounded, and trenches are dug for the dead. There should be no real neglect of the dead, because it has a bad effect on the living, for each soldier values himself and comrade as highly as though he were living in a good house at home. The regimental chaplain, if any, usually attends the burials from the hospital, should make notes and communicate details to the captain of the company and to the family at home. Of course, it is usually impossible to mark the grave with names, dates, etc., and consequently the names of the unknown in our national cemeteries equal about 1/2 of all the dead. Very few of the battles in which I have participated were fought as described in European textbooks, viz., in great masses in perfect order, maneuvering by corps, divisions, and brigades. We were generally in a wooded country, and though our lines were deployed according to tactics, the men generally fought in strong skirmish lines, taking advantage of the shape of ground and of every cover. We were generally the assailants, and in wooded and broken countries, the defensive had a positive advantage over us, for they were always ready, had cover, and always knew the ground to their immediate front. Whereas we, their assailants, had to grope our way over unknown ground, and generally found a cleared field or prepared entanglements that held us for a time under a close and withering fire. Rarely did the opposing lines in compact order come into actual contact, but when, as at Peachtree Creek and Atlanta, the lines did become commingled, the men fought individually in every possible style, more frequently with the musket clubbed than with the bayonet, and in some instances the men clinched like wrestlers and went to the ground together. Europeans frequently criticized our war because we did not always take full advantage of a victory. The true reason was that habitually the woods served as a screen, and we often did not realize the fact that our enemy had retreated till he was already miles away and was again entrenched, having left a mere skirmish line to cover the movement, in turn to fall back to the new position. Our war was fought with the muzzle-loading rifle. Toward the close, I had 1 brigade Walcutts armed with breech-loading Spencers. The cavalry generally had breech-loading carbines, Spencers, and Sharps, both of which were good arms. The only change that breech-loading arms will probably make in the art and practice of war will be to increase the amount of ammunition to be expended and necessarily to be carried along, to still further thin out the lines of attack, and to reduce battles to short, quick, decisive conflicts. It does not in the least affect the grand strategy or the necessity for perfect organization, drill, and discipline. The companies and battalions will be more dispersed, and the men will be less under the immediate eye of their officers, and therefore a higher order of intelligence and courage on the part of the individual soldier will be an element of strength. When a regiment is deployed as skirmishers and crosses an open field or woods under heavy fire, if each man runs forward from tree to tree or stump to stump, and yet preserves a good general alignment, it gives great confidence to the men themselves, for they always keep their eyes well to the right and left and watch their comrades. But when some few hold back, stick too close or too long to a comfortable log, it often stops the line and defeats the whole object. Therefore, the more we improve the firearm, the more will be the necessity for good organization, good discipline and intelligence on the part of the individual soldier and officer. There is, of course, such a thing as individual courage, which has a value in war, but familiarity with danger, experience in war and its common attendants, and personal habit are equally valuable traits, and these are the qualities with which we usually have to deal in war. All men naturally shrink from pain and danger, and only incur their risk from some higher motive or from habit, so that I would define true courage to be a perfect sensibility of the measure of danger, and a mental willingness to incur it, rather than that insensibility to danger of which I have heard far more than I have seen. The most courageous men are generally unconscious of possessing the quality. Therefore, when one professes it too openly, by words or bearing, there is reason to mistrust it. I would further illustrate my meaning by describing a man of true courage to be one who possesses all his faculties and senses perfectly when serious danger is actually present. Modern wars have not materially changed the relative values or proportions of the several arms of service: infantry, artillery, cavalry, and engineers. If anything, the infantry has been increased in value. The danger of cavalry attempting to charge infantry armed with breech-loading rifles was fully illustrated at Sedan, and with us very frequently. So improbable has such a thing become that we have omitted the infantry square from our recent tactics. Still, cavalry against cavalry, and as auxiliary to infantry, will always be valuable, while all great wars will, as heretofore, depend chiefly on the infantry. Artillery is more valuable with new and inexperienced troops than with veterans. In the early stages of the war, the field guns often bore the proportion of 6 to 1,000 men, but toward the close of the war 1 gun, or at most 2 to 1,000 men, was deemed enough. Sieges, such as characterize the wars of the last century, are too slow for this period of the world, and the Prussians recently almost ignored them altogether, penetrated France between the forts, and left a superior force in observation. To watch the garrison and accept its surrender when the greater events of the war ahead made further resistance useless. But earth forts, and especially field works, will hereafter play an important part in war, because they enable a minor force to hold a superior one in check for a time, and time is a most valuable element in all wars. It was one of Prof. Mahan's maxims that the spade was as useful in war as the musket, and to this I will add the axe. The habit of entrenching certainly does have the effect of making new troops timid. When a line of battle is once covered by a good parapet, made by the engineers or by the labor of the men themselves, it does require an effort to make them leave it in the face of danger. But when the enemy is entrenched, it becomes absolutely necessary to permit each brigade and division of the troops immediately opposed to throw up a corresponding trench for their own protection in case of a sudden sally. We invariably did this in all our recent campaigns, and it had no ill effect, though sometimes our troops were a little too slow in leaving their well-covered lines to assail the enemy in position or on retreat. Even our skirmishers were in the habit of rolling logs together or of making a lunette of rails with dirt in front to cover their bodies, and though it revealed their position, I cannot say that it worked a bad effect, so that, as a rule, it may safely be left to the men themselves. On the defensive, there is no doubt of the propriety of fortifying. But in the assailing army, the general must watch closely to see that his men do not neglect an opportunity to drop his precautionary defenses and act promptly on the offensive at every chance. I have many a time crept forward to the skirmish line to avail myself of the cover of the picket's little fort, to observe more closely some expected result, and always talked familiarly with the men, and was astonished to see how well they comprehended the general object, and how accurately they were informed of the state of facts existing miles away from their particular corps. Soldiers are very quick to catch the general drift and purpose of a campaign, and are always sensible when they are well commanded or well cared for. Once impressed with this fact, and that they are making progress, they bear cheerfully any amount of labor and privation. In camp, and especially in the presence of an active enemy, it is much easier to maintain discipline than in barracks in time of peace. Crime and breaches of discipline are much less frequent, and the necessity for courts-martial far less. The captain can usually inflict all the punishment necessary, and the colonel should always. The field officer's court is the best form for war, viz. One of the field officers, the lieutenant colonel or major, can examine the case and report his verdict, and the colonel should execute it. Of course, there are statutory offenses which demand a general court-martial, and these must be ordered by the division or corps commander. But the presence of one of our regular civilian judge-advocates in an army in the field would be a first-class nuisance, for technical courts always work mischief. Too many courts-martial in any command are evidence of poor discipline and inefficient officers. For the rapid transmission of orders in an army covering a large space of ground, the magnetic telegraph is by far the best, though habitually the paper and pencil, with good mounted orderlies, answer every purpose. I have little faith in the signal service by flags and torches, though we always used them, because almost invariably when they were most needed, the view was cut off by intervening trees or by mists and fogs. There was one notable instance in my experience, when the signal flags carried a message of vital importance over the heads of Hood's army, which had interposed between me and Allatoona, and had broken the telegraph wires as recorded in Chapter 19. But the value of the magnetic telegraph in war cannot be exaggerated, as was illustrated by the perfect concert of action between the armies in Virginia and Georgia during 1864. Hardly a day intervened when General Grant did not know the exact state of facts with me, more than 1,500 miles away as the wires ran. So on the field, a thin insulated wire may be run on improvised stakes or from tree to tree for 6 or more miles in a couple of hours, and I have seen operators so skillful that by cutting the wire they would receive a message with their tongues from a distant station. As a matter of course, the ordinary commercial wires along the railways form the usual telegraph lines for an army, and these are easily repaired and extended as the army advances. But each army and wing should have a small party of skilled men to put up the field wire and take it down when done. This is far better than the signal flags and torches. Our commercial telegraph lines will always supply for war enough skillful operators. The value of railways is also fully recognized in war quite as much as, if not more so than, in peace. The Atlanta campaign would simply have been impossible without the use of the railroads from Louisville to Nashville 100, and 85 miles from Nashville to Chattanooga 100, and 51 miles end from Chattanooga to Atlanta 137 miles. Every mile of this single track was so delicate that one man could in a minute have broken or moved a rail, but our trains usually carried along the tools and means to repair such a break. We had, however, to maintain strong guards and garrisons at each important bridge or trestle the destruction of which would have necessitated time for rebuilding. For the protection of a bridge, 1 or 2 log blockhouses, 2 stories high, with a piece of ordnance and a small infantry guard, usually sufficed. The blockhouse had a small parapet and ditch about it, and the roof was made shot-proof by earth piled on. These points could usually be reached only by a dash of the enemy's cavalry, and many of these blockhouses successfully resisted serious attacks by both cavalry and artillery. The only blockhouse that was actually captured on the main was the one described near Allatoona. Our trains from Nashville forward were operated under military rules and ran about 10 miles an hour in gangs of 4 trains of 10 cars each. 4 such groups of trains daily made 160 cars, of 10 tons each, carrying 1,600 tons, which exceeded the absolute necessity of the army and allowed for the accidents that were common and inevitable. But as I have recorded, that single stem of railroad, 473 miles long, supplied an army of 100,000 men and 35,000 animals for the period of 196 days, viz. from May 1 to November 12, 1864. To have delivered regularly that amount of food and forage by ordinary wagons would have required 36,800 wagons of 6 mules each, allowing each wagon to have hauled 2 tons 20 miles each day. A simple impossibility in roads such as then existed in that region of country. Therefore, I reiterate that the Atlanta campaign was an impossibility without these railroads, and only then because we had the men and means to maintain and defend them, in addition to what were necessary to overcome the enemy. Habitually, a passenger car will carry 50 men with their necessary baggage. Boxcars and even platform cars answer the purpose well enough, but they should always have rough board seats. For sick and wounded men, boxcars filled with straw or bushes were usually employed. Personally, I saw but little of the practical working of the railroads, for I only turned back once as far as Resaca. But I had daily reports from the engineer in charge, and officers who came from the rear often explained to me the whole thing, with a description of the wrecked trains all the way from Nashville to Atlanta. I am convinced that the risk to life to the engineers and men on that railroad fully equaled that on the skirmish line, called for as high an order of courage, and fully equaled it in importance. Still, I doubt if there be any necessity in time of peace to organize a corps specially to work the military railroads in time of war. Because in peace, these same men gain all the necessary experience, possess all the daring and courage of soldiers, and only need the occasional protection and assistance of the necessary train guard, which may be composed of the furloughed men coming and going, or of details made from the local garrisons to the rear. For the transfer of large armies by rail, from one theater of action to another by the rear, the cases of the transfer of the 11th and 12th Corps General Hooker, 23,000 men from the east to Chattanooga, 1,192 miles in 7 days, in the fall of 1863. And that of the Army of the Ohio General Schofield, 15,000 men from the valley of the Tennessee to Washington, 1,400 miles in 11 days, en route to North Carolina in January 1865, are the best examples of which I have any knowledge. and reference to these is made in the report of the Secretary of War, Mr. Stanton, dated November 22, 1865. Engineer troops attached to an army are habitually employed in supervising the construction of forts or field works of a nature more permanent than the lines need by the troops in motion, and in repairing roads and making bridges. I had several regiments of this kind that were most useful, but as a rule we used the infantry, or employed parties of freedmen, who worked on the trenches at night while the soldiers slept, and these in turn rested by day. Habitually, the repair of the railroad and its bridges was committed to hired laborers, like the English navies, under the supervision of Colonel W. W. Wright, a railroad engineer, who was in the military service at the time, and his successful labors were frequently referred to in the official reports of the campaign. For the passage of rivers, each Army Corps had a pontoon train with a detachment of engineers, and, on reaching a river, the leading infantry division was charged with the labor of putting it down. Generally, the single pontoon train could provide for 900 feet of bridge, which sufficed. But when the rivers were very wide, two such trains would be brought together, or the single train was supplemented by a trestle bridge, or bridges made on cribwork, out of timber found near the place. The pontoons in general use were skeleton frames, made with a hinge, so as to fold back and constitute a wagon body. In this same wagon were carried the cotton canvas cover, the anchor and chains, and a due proportion of the balks, cheeses, and lashings. All the troops became very familiar with their mechanism and use, and we were rarely delayed by reason of a river, however broad. I saw, recently, in Aldershot, England, a very complete pontoon train. The boats were sheathed with wood and felt, made very light. But I think these were more liable to chafing and damage in rough handling than were our less expensive and rougher boats. On the whole, I would prefer the skeleton frame and canvas cover to any style of pontoon that I have ever seen. In relation to guards, pickets, and vedettes, I doubt if any discoveries or improvements were made during our war or in any of the modern wars in Europe. These precautions vary with the nature of the country and the situation of each army. When advancing or retreating in line of battle, the usual skirmish line constitutes the picket line and may have reserves, but usually the main line of battle constitutes the reserve. And in this connection, I will state that the recent innovation introduced into the new infantry tactics by General Upton is admirable, for by it each regiment, brigade, and division deployed sends forward as skirmishers the one man of each set of fours to cover its own front, and these can be recalled or reinforced at pleasure by the bugle signal. For flank guards and rear guards, one or more companies should be detached under their own officers, instead of making up the guard by detailing men from the several companies. For regimental or camp guards, the details should be made according to existing Army regulations, and all the guards should be posted early in the evening so as to afford each sentinel or vedette a chance to study his ground before it becomes too dark. In like manner as to the staff, the more intimately it comes into contact with the troops, the more useful and valuable it becomes. The almost entire separation of the staff from the line, as now practiced by us, and hitherto by the French, has proved mischievous, and the great retinues of staff officers with which some of our earlier generals began the war were simply ridiculous. I don't believe in a chief of staff at all, and any general commanding an army, corps, or division that has a staff officer who professes to know more than his chief is to be pitied. Each regiment should have a competent adjutant, quartermaster, and commissary, with 2 or 3 medical officers. Each brigade commander should have the same staff, with the addition of a couple of young aides-de-camp, habitually selected from the subalterns of the brigade, who should be good riders and intelligent enough to give and explain the orders of their general. The same staff will answer for a division. The general in command of a separate army and of a corps d'armée should have the same professional assistants, with 2 or more good engineers, and his adjutant general should exercise all the functions usually ascribed to a chief of staff, viz., he should possess the ability to comprehend the scope of operations, and to make verbally and in writing all the orders and details necessary to carry into effect the views of his general, as well as to keep the returns and records of events for the information of the next higher authority and for history. A bulky staff implies a division of responsibility, slowness of action, and indecision, whereas a small staff implies activity and concentration of purpose. The smallness of General Grant's staff throughout the Civil War forms the best model for future imitation. So of tents, officers' furniture, etc., etc. In real war these should all be discarded, and an army is efficient for action and motion exactly in the inverse ratio of its impedimenta. Tents should be omitted altogether, save one to a regiment for an office, and a few for the division hospital. Officers should be content with a tent fly, improvising poles and shelter out of bushes. The tent's debris, or shelter tent, carried by the soldier himself, is all sufficient. Officers should never seek for houses, but share the condition of their men. A recent message, July 18, 1874, made to the French Assembly by Marshal MacMahon, President of the French Republic, submits a projet de loi with a report prepared by a board of French generals on army administration, which is full of information and is as applicable to us as to the French. I quote from its very beginning. The misfortunes of the campaign of 1870 have demonstrated the inferiority of our system. Two separate organizations existed with parallel functions: the general, more occupied in giving direction to his troops than in providing for their material wants, which he regarded as the special province of the staff, and the intendant, staff, often working at random, taking on his shoulders a crushing burden of functions and duties, exhausting himself with useless efforts, and aiming to accomplish an insufficient service, to the disappointment of everybody. This separation of the administration and command, this coexistence of two wills, each independent of the other, which paralyzed both and annulled the dualism, was condemned. It was decided by the board that this error should be proscribed in the new military system. The report then goes on at great length discussing the provisions of the new law, which is described to be a radical change from the old one on the same subject. While conceding to the Minister of War in Paris the general control and supervision of the entire military establishment primarily, especially of the annual estimates or budget, and the great depots of supply, it distributes to the commanders of the corps d'armée in time of peace, and to all army commanders generally in time of war, the absolute command of the money, provisions, and stores, with the necessary staff officers to receive, issue, and account for them. I quote further, the object of this law is to confer on the commander of troops whatever liberty of action the case demands. He has the power even to go beyond the regulations in circumstances of urgency and pressing necessity. The extraordinary measures he may take on these occasions may require their execution without delay. The staff officer has but one duty before obeying, and that is to submit his observations to the general and to ask his orders in writing. With this formality, his responsibility ceases, and the responsibility for the extraordinary act falls solely on the general who gives the order. The officers and agents charged with supplies are placed under the orders of the general in command of the troops. That is, they are obliged both in war and peace to obey, with the single qualification above named, of first making their observations and securing the written order of the general. With us today, the law and regulations are that, no matter what may be the emergency, the commanding general in Texas, New Mexico, and the remote frontiers cannot draw from the arsenals a pistol cartridge or any sort of ordnance stores, without first procuring an order of the Secretary of War in Washington. The commanding general, though entrusted with the lives of his soldiers and with the safety of a frontier in a condition of chronic war, cannot touch or be trusted with ordnance stores or property, and that is declared to be the law. Every officer of the old army remembers how, in 1861, we were hampered with the old Blue Army regulations, which tied our hands, and that to do anything positive and necessary, we had to tear it all to pieces, cut the red tape, as it was called, a dangerous thing for an army to do, for it was calculated to bring the law and authority into contempt. But war was upon us, and overwhelming necessity overrides all law. This French report is well worth the study of our army officers, of all grades and classes, and I will only refer again, casually, to another part, wherein it discusses the subject of military correspondence, whether the staff officer should correspond directly with his chief in Paris, submitting to his general copies, or whether he should be required to carry on his correspondence through his general, so that the latter could promptly forward the communication, endorsed with his own remarks and opinions. The latter is declared by the board to be the only safe role, because the general should never be ignorant of anything that is transpiring that concerns his command. In this country, as in France, Congress controls the great questions of war and peace, makes all laws for the creation and government of armies, and votes the necessary supplies, leaving to the president to execute and apply these laws, especially the harder task of limiting the expenditure of public money to the amount of the annual appropriations. The executive power is further subdivided into the 7 great departments, and to the Secretary of War is confided the general care of the military establishment, and his powers are further subdivided into 10 distinct and separate bureaus. The chiefs of these bureaus are under the immediate orders of the Secretary of War, who, through them, in fact commands the army from his office, but cannot do so in the field, an absurdity in military if not civil law. The subordinates of these staff corps and departments are selected and chosen from the army itself, or fresh from West Point, and 2 commonly construe themselves into the elite, as made of better clay than the common soldier. Thus they separate themselves more and more from their comrades of the line, and in process of time realize the condition of that old officer of artillery who thought the army would be a delightful place for a gentleman if it were not for the DD soldier. Or, better still, the conclusion of the young lord in Henry Roman IV, who told Harry Percy, Hotspur, that but for these vile guns he would himself have been a soldier. This is all wrong, utterly at variance with our democratic form of government and of universal experience. And now that the French, from whom we had copied the system, have utterly proscribed it, I hope that our Congress will follow suit. I admit, in its fullest force, the strength of the maxim that the civil law should be superior to the military in time of peace, that the army should be at all times subject to the direct control of Congress. And I assert that, from the formation of our government to the present day, the regular army has set the highest example of obedience to law and authority. But for the very reason that our army is comparatively so very small, I hold that it should be the best possible, organized and governed on true military principles, and that in time of peace we should preserve the habits and usages of war, so that, when war does come, we may not again be compelled to suffer the disgrace, confusion, and disorder of 1861. The commanding officers of divisions, departments, and posts should have the amplest powers, not only to command their troops, but all the stores designed for their use, and the officers of the staff necessary to administer them within the area of their command. And then with fairness they could be held to the most perfect responsibility. The President and Secretary of War can command the army quite as well through these generals as through the subordinate staff officers. Of course, the Secretary would, as now, distribute the funds according to the appropriation bills, and reserve to himself the absolute control and supervision of the larger arsenals and depots of supply. The error lies in the law or in the judicial interpretation thereof, and no code of army regulations can be made that meets the case, until Congress, like the French corps legislatif, utterly annihilates and proscribes the old law and the system which has grown up under it. It is related of Napoleon that his last words were, "Titre d'armée." Doubtless, as the shadow of death obscured his memory, the last thought that remained for speech was of some event when he was directing an important head of column. I believe that every general who has handled armies in battle most recall from his own experience the intensity of thought on some similar occasion, when by a single command he had given the finishing stroke to some complicated action. But to me recurs another thought that is worthy of record, and may encourage others who are to follow us in our profession. I never saw the rear of an army engaged in battle, but I feared that some calamity had happened at the front. The apparent confusion, broken wagons, crippled horses, men lying about dead and maimed, parties hastening to and fro in seeming disorder, and a general apprehension of something dreadful about to ensue. All these signs, however, lessened as I neared the front, and there the contrast was complete perfect order, men and horses full of confidence, and it was not unusual for general hilarity, laughing, and cheering. Although cannon might be firing, the musketry clattering, and the enemy's shot hitting close, there reigned a general feeling of strength and security that bore a marked contrast to the bloody signs that had drifted rapidly to the rear. Therefore, for comfort and safety, I surely would rather be at the front than the rear line of battle. So also on the march, the head of a column moves on steadily, while the rear is alternately halting and then rushing forward to close up the gap. And all sorts of rumors, especially the worst, float back to the rear. Old troops invariably deem it a special privilege to be in the front, to be at the head of column, because experience has taught them that it is the easiest and most comfortable place, and danger only adds zest and stimulus to this fact. The hardest task in war is to lie in support of some position or battery, under fire without the privilege of returning it, or to guard some train left in the rear, within hearing but out of danger, or to provide for the wounded and dead of some corps which is too busy ahead to care for its own. To be at the head of a strong column of troops, in the execution of some task that requires brain, is the highest pleasure of war, a grim one and terrible, but which leaves on the mind and memory the strongest mark. To detect the weak point of an enemy's line, to break through with vehemence and thus lead to victory, or to discover some key point and hold it with tenacity, or to do some other distinct act which is afterward recognized as the real cause of success. These all become matters that are never forgotten. Other great difficulties, experienced by every general, are to measure truly the 1,001 reports that come to him in the midst of conflict, to preserve a clear and well-defined purpose at every instant of time, and to cause all efforts to converge to that end. To do these things, he must know perfectly the strength and quality of each part of his own army, as well as that of his opponent, and must be where he can personally see and observe with his own eyes and judge with his own mind. No man can properly command an army from the rear; he must be at its front. And when a detachment is made, the commander thereof should be informed of the object to be accomplished, and left as free as possible to execute it in his own way. And when an army is divided up into several parts, the superior should always attend that one which he regards as most important. Some men think that modern armies may be so regulated that a general can sit in an office and play on his several columns as on the keys of a piano. This is a fearful mistake. The directing mind must be at the very head of the army, must be seen there, and the effect of his mind and personal energy must be felt by every officer and man present with it to secure the best results. Every attempt to make war easy and safe will result in humiliation and disaster. Lastly, mail facilities should be kept up with an army if possible, that officers and men may receive and send letters to their friends, thus maintaining the home influence of infinite assistance to discipline. Newspaper correspondence with an army, as a rule, are mischievous. They are the world's gossips, pick up and retell the camp scandal, and gradually drift to the headquarters of some general, who finds it easier to make reputation at home than with his own corps or division. They are also tempted to prophesy events and state facts which, to an enemy, reveal a purpose in time to guard against it. Moreover, they are always bound to see facts colored by the partisan or political character of their own patrons, and thus bring army officers into the political controversies of the day, which are always mischievous and wrong. Yet, so greedy are the people at large for war news, that it is doubtful whether any army commander can exclude all reporters without bringing down on himself a clamor that may imperil his own safety. Time and moderation must bring a just solution to this modern difficulty. Chapter 26. After the war. In the foregoing pages, I have endeavored to describe the public events in which I was an actor or spectator before and during the Civil War of 1861-65, and it now only remains for me to treat of similar matters of general interest subsequent to the Civil War. Within a few days of the Grand Review of May 24, 1865, I took leave of the army at Washington, and with my family went to Chicago to attend a fair held in the interest of the families of soldiers impoverished by the war. I remained there about 2 weeks. On the 22nd of June was at South Bend, Indiana, where 2 of my children were at school, and reached my native place, Lancaster, Ohio, on the 24th. On the 4th of July, I visited at Louisville, Kentucky, the 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th Army Corps, which had come from Washington, under the command of General John A. Logan, for muster out or further orders. I then made a short visit to General George H. Thomas at Nashville and returned to Lancaster, where I remained with the family till the receipt of General Orders No. 118 of June 27, 1865, which divided the whole territory of the United States into 19 departments and 5 military divisions, the second of which was the Military Division of the Mississippi, afterward changed to Missouri. Major General W. T. Sherman to command, with headquarters at St. Louis, to embrace the departments of the Ohio, Missouri, and Arkansas. This territorial command included the states north of the Ohio River and the states and territories north of Texas, as far west as the Rocky Mountains, including Montana, Utah, and New Mexico. But the part east of the Mississippi was soon transferred to another division. The department commanders were General E.O.C. Ord at Detroit, General John Pope at Fort Leavenworth, and General J.J. Reynolds at Little Rock, but these also were soon changed. I at once assumed command and ordered my staff and headquarters from Washington to St. Louis, Missouri, going there in person on the 16th of July. My thoughts and feelings at once reverted to the construction of the Great Pacific Railway, which had been chartered by Congress in the midst of war, and was then in progress. I put myself in communication with the parties engaged in the work, visiting them in person, and assured them that I would afford them all possible assistance and encouragement. Dr. Durant, the leading man of the Union Pacific, seemed to me a person of ardent nature, of great ability and energy, enthusiastic in his undertaking, and determined to build the road from Omaha to San Francisco. He had an able corps of assistants, collecting materials, letting out contracts for ties, grading, etc., and I attended the celebration of the first completed division of 16.5 miles, from Omaha to Papillon. When the orators spoke so confidently of the determination to build 2,000 miles of railway across the plains, mountains, and desert, devoid of timber, with no population, but on the contrary raided by the bold and bloody Sioux and Cheyennes, who had almost successfully defied our power for half a century, I was disposed to treat it jocularly, because I could not help recall our California experience of 1855-56. When we celebrated the completion of 22.5 miles of the same road eastward of Sacramento, on which occasion Edward Baker had electrified us by his unequaled oratory, painting the glorious things which would result from uniting the western coast with the east by bands of iron. Baker then, with a poet's imagination, saw the vision of the mighty future, but not the gulf which meantime was destined to swallow up 500,000 of the brightest and best youth of our land, and that he himself would be one of the first victims far away on the banks of the Potomac. He was killed in battle at Ball's Bluff, October 21, 1861. The Kansas Pacific was designed to unite with the main branch about the 100 Deg. Meridian, near Fort Kearny. Mr. Shoemaker was its general superintendent and building contractor, and this branch in 1865 was finished about 40 miles to a point near Lawrence, Kansas. I may not be able to refer to these roads again, except incidentally, and will, therefore, record here that the location of this branch afterward was changed from the Republican to the Smoky Hill Fork of the Kansas River, and is now the main line to Denver. The Union and Central Railroads from the beginning were pushed with a skill, vigor, and courage which always commanded my admiration. The two meeting at Promontory Point, Utah, July 15, 1869, and in my judgment constitute one of the greatest and most beneficent achievements of man on earth. The construction of the Union Pacific Railroad was deemed so important that the President, at my suggestion, constituted on the 5th of March, 1866, the new Department of the Platte, General P. St. George Cook commanding, succeeded by General C. Auger, headquarters at Omaha, with orders to give ample protection to the working parties and to afford every possible assistance in the construction of the road. And subsequently in like manner, the Department of Dakota was constituted, General A. H. Terry commanding, with headquarters at St. Paul, to give similar protection and encouragement to the Northern Pacific Railroad. These departments, with changed commanders, have continued up to the present day, and have fulfilled perfectly the uses for which they were designed. During the years 1865 and 1866, the Great Plains remained almost in a state of nature. being the pasture fields of about 10 million buffalo, deer, elk, and antelope, and were in full possession of the Sioux, Cheyennes, Arapahoes, and Kiowas, a race of bold Indians, who saw plainly that the construction of two parallel railroads right through their country would prove destructive to the game on which they subsisted, and consequently fatal to themselves. The troops were posted to the best advantage to protect the parties engaged in building these roads, and in person I reconnoitered well to the front, traversing the buffalo regions from south to north, and from east to west, often with a very small escort, mingling with the Indians whenever safe, and thereby gained personal knowledge of matters which enabled me to use the troops to the best advantage. I am sure that without the courage and activity of the department commanders with the small bodies of regular troops on the plains during the years 1866-69, the Pacific railroads could not have been built. But once built, and in full operation, the fate of the buffalo and Indian was settled for all time to come. At the close of the Civil War, there were 1,516 names on the muster rolls, of which 797,807 were present, and 202,709 absent, of which 22,929 were regulars. The others were volunteers, colored troops, and veteran reserves. The regulars consisted of 6 regiments of cavalry, 5 of artillery, and 19 of infantry. By the Act of July 28, 1866, the peace establishment was fixed at 1 General Grant, 1 Lieutenant General Sherman, 5 Major Generals Halleck, Meade, Sheridan, Thomas, and Hancock, 10 Brigadiers McDowell, Cook, Pope, Hooker, Schofield, Howard, Terry, Ord, Canby, and Rousseau, 10 regiments of cavalry, 5 of artillery, and 45 of infantry, admitting of an aggregate force of 54,641 men. All others were mustered out, and thus were remanded to their homes nearly 1 million of strong, vigorous men who had imbibed the somewhat erratic habits of the soldier. These were of every profession and trade in life, who, on regaining their homes, found their places occupied by others, that their friends and neighbors were different, and that they themselves had changed. They naturally looked for new homes to the Great West, to the new territories and states as far as the Pacific coast, and we realize today that the vigorous men who control Kansas, Nebraska, Dakota, Montana, Colorado, etc., were soldiers of the Civil War. These men flocked to the plains and were rather stimulated than retarded by the danger of an Indian war. This was another potent agency in producing the result we enjoy today, in having in so short a time replaced the wild buffaloes by more numerous herds of tame cattle, and by substituting for the useless Indians the intelligent owners of productive farms and cattle ranches. While these great changes were being wrought at the West, in the East politics had resumed full sway, and all the methods of anti-war times had been renewed. President Johnson had differed with his party as to the best method of reconstructing the state governments of the South, which had been destroyed and impoverished by the war, and the press began to agitate the question of the next president. Of course, all Union men naturally turned to General Grant, and the result was jealousy of him by the personal friends of President Johnson and some of his cabinet. Mr. Johnson always seemed very patriotic and friendly, and I believed him honest and sincere in his declared purpose to follow strictly the Constitution of the United States in restoring the Southern states to their normal place in the Union. But the same cordial friendship subsisted between General Grant and myself, which was the outgrowth of personal relations dating back to 1839. So I resolved to keep out of this conflict. In September 1866, I was in the mountains of New Mexico when a message reached me that I was wanted at Washington. I had with me a couple of officers and half a dozen soldiers as escort, and traveled down the Arkansas, through the Kiowas, Comanches, Cheyennes, and Arapahoes, all more or less disaffected, but reached St. Louis in safety, and proceeded to Washington, where I reported to General Grant. He explained to me that President Johnson wanted to see me. He did not know the why or wherefore, but supposed it had some connection with an order he, General Grant, had received to escort the newly appointed minister, Hun. Lew Campbell, of Ohio, to the court of Juarez, the president-elect of Mexico, which country was still in possession of the Emperor Maximilian, supported by a corps of French troops commanded by General Bazaine. General Grant denied the right of the president to order him on a diplomatic mission unattended by troops, said that he had thought the matter over, whirled disobey the order, and stand the consequences. He manifested much feeling, and said it was a plot to get rid of him. I then went to President Johnson, who treated me with great cordiality, and said that he was very glad I had come. That General Grant was about to go to Mexico on business of importance, and he wanted me at Washington to command the army in General Grant's absence. I then informed him that General Grant would not go, and he seemed amazed. Said that it was generally understood that General Grant construed the occupation of the territories of our neighbor, Mexico, by French troops, and the establishment of an empire therein, with an Austrian prince at its head, as hostile to Republican America, and that the administration had arranged with the French government for the withdrawal of Bazin's troops, which would leave the country free for the president-elect Juarez to reoccupy the city of Mexico, etc., etc. That Mr. Campbell had been accredited to Juarez, and the fact that he was accompanied by so distinguished a soldier as General Grant would emphasize the act of the United States. I simply reiterated that General Grant would not go, and that he, Mr. Johnson, could not afford to quarrel with him at that time. I further argued that General Grant was at the moment engaged on the most delicate and difficult task of reorganizing the army under the Act of July 28, 1866. That if the real object was to put Mr. Campbell in official communication with President Juarez, supposed to be at El Paso or Monterrey, either General Hancock, whose command embraced New Mexico, or General Sheridan, whose command included Texas, could fulfill the object perfectly. Or, in the event of neither of these alternates proving satisfactory to the Secretary of State, that I could be easier spared than General Grant. Certainly, answered the President, if you will go, that will answer perfectly. The instructions of the Secretary of State, W. H. Seward, to Hun. Louis D. Campbell, Minister to Mexico, dated October 25, 1866. A letter from President Johnson to Secretary of War Stanton, dated October 26, 1866. And the letter of Edwin M. Stanton, Secretary of War, to General Grant, dated October 27, had been already prepared and printed, and the originals or copies were furnished me. But on the 30th of October, 1866, the following letter passed. Executive Mansion, Washington, D.C., October 301,866. Sir, General Ulysses S. Grant, having found it inconvenient to assume the duties specified in my letter to you of the 26th inst. You will please relieve him, and assign them in all respects to William T. Sherman, Lieutenant General of the Army of the United States. By way of guiding General Sherman in the performance of his duties, you will furnish him with a copy of your special orders to General Grant made in compliance with my letter of the 26th inst. Together with a copy of the instructions of the Secretary of State to Louis D. Campbell, Esquire, therein mentioned. The Lieutenant General will proceed to the execution of his duties without delay. Very respectfully yours, Andrew Johnson to the Hun, Edwin M. Stanton, Secretary of War. At the Navy Department, I learned that the United States ship Susquehanna, Captain Alden, was fitting out in New York for the use of this mission, and that there would be time for me to return to St. Louis to make arrangements for a prolonged absence, as also to communicate with Mr. Campbell, who was still at his home in Hamilton, Ohio. By correspondence, we agreed to meet in New York, November 8th, he accompanied by Mr. Plum, Secretary of Legation, and I by my aide, Colonel Audenried. We embarked November 10th, and went to sea next day, making for Havana and Vera Cruz, and, as soon as we were outside of Sandy Hook, I explained to Captain Alden that my mission was ended, because I believed by substituting myself for General Grant I had prevented a serious quarrel between him and the administration, which was unnecessary. We reached Havana on the 18th, with nothing to vary the monotony of an ordinary sea voyage. Except off Hatteras, we picked up 1 woman and 20 men from open boats, who had just abandoned a propeller bound from Baltimore to Charleston, which foundered. The sea was very rough, but by the personal skill and supervision of Captain Alden, every soul reached our deck safely and was carried to our consul at Havana. At Havana, we were very handsomely entertained, especially by Señor Aldama, who took us by rail to his sugar estates at Santa Rosa and back by Matanzas. We took our departure thence on the 25th and anchored under Isla Verde, off Vera Cruz, on the 29th. Everything about Vera Cruz indicated the purpose of the French to withdraw, and also that the Emperor Maximilian would precede them, for the Austrian frigate Dandolo was in port, and an Austrian bark, on which were received, according to the report of our consul, Mr. Lane, as many as 1,100 packages of private furniture to be transferred to Miramar, Maximilian's home. And Lieutenant Clarin of the French Navy, who visited the Susquehanna from the French Commodore Clouet, told me, without reserve, that if we had delayed 8 days more, we would have found Maximilian gone. General Bazin was reported to be in the city of Mexico with about 28,000 French troops. But instead of leaving Mexico in 3 detachments, viz., November 1866, March 1867, and November 1867, as described in Mr. Seward's letter to Mr. Campbell of October 25, 1866, it looked to me that, as a soldier, he would evacuate at some time before November 1867 all at once, and not by detachments. Lieutenant Clarin telegraphed Bazin at the City of Mexico the fact of our arrival, and he sent me a most courteous and pressing invitation to come up to the city. But, as we were accredited to the government of Juarez, it was considered undiplomatic to establish friendly relations with the existing authorities. Meantime, we could not hear a word of Juarez, and concluded to search for him along the coast northward. When I was in Versailles, France, July 1872, learning that General Bazin was in arrest for the surrender of his army and post at Metz in 1870, I wanted to call on him to thank him for his courteous invitation to me at Vera Cruz in 1866. I inquired of President Thiera if I could with propriety call on the Marshal. He answered that it would be very acceptable, no doubt, but suggested for form's sake that I should consult the Minister of War, General de Sissy, which I did, and he promptly assented. Accordingly, I called with my aide, Colonel Audenried, on Marshal Bazin, who occupied a small 2-story stone house at Versailles, in an enclosure with a high garden wall, at the front gate or door of which was a lodge, in which was a military guard. We were shown to a good room on the 2nd floor, where was seated the Marshal in military half-dress, with large head, full face, short neck, and evidently a man of strong physique. He did not speak English, but spoke Spanish perfectly. We managed to carry on a conversation, in which I endeavored to convey my sense of his politeness in inviting me so cordially up to the City of Mexico, and my regret that the peculiar duty on which I was engaged did not admit of a compliance, or even of an intelligent explanation, at the time. He spoke of the whole Mexican business as a sad affair, that the empire necessarily fell with the result of our civil war, and that poor Maximilian was sacrificed to his own high sense of honor. While on board the Susquehanna, on the 1st day of December, 1866, we received the proclamation made by the Emperor Maximilian ad Orizaba, in which, notwithstanding the near withdrawal of the French troops, he declared his purpose to remain and shed the last drop of his blood in defense of his dear country. Undoubtedly, many of the most substantial people of Mexico, having lost all faith in the stability of the native government, had committed themselves to what they considered the more stable government of Maximilian, and Maximilian, a man of honor, concluded at the last moment he could not abandon them. The consequence was his death. Failing to hear of Juarez, we steamed up the coast to the island of Lobos, and on to Tampico, off which we found the United States steamer Paul Jones, which, drawing less water than the Susquehanna, carried us over the bar to the city. Then in possession of the Liberal Party, which recognized Juarez as their constitutional president, but of Juarez and his whereabout we could hear not a word. So we continued up the coast and anchored off Brazos, Santiago, December 7th. Going ashore in small boats, we found a railroad, under the management of General J.R. West, now one of the commissioners of the city of Washington, who sent us up to Brownsville, Texas. We met on the way General Sheridan, returning from a tour of inspection of the Rio Grande frontier. On Sunday, December 9th, we were all at Memoirs, Mexico, where we met General Escobedo, one of Juarez's trusty lieutenants, who developed to us the general plan agreed on for the overthrow of the empire and the re-establishment of the Republican government of Mexico. He asked of us no assistance, except the loan of some arms, ammunition, clothing, and camp equipage. It was agreed that Mr. Campbell should, as soon as he could get his baggage off the Susquehanna, return to Matamoras, and thence proceed to Monterey to be received by Juarez in person as the accredited minister of the United States to the Republic of Mexico. Meantime, the weather off the coast was stormy, and the Susquehanna parted a cable, so that we were delayed some days at Brazos. But in due time, Mr. Campbell got his baggage, and we regained the deck of the Susquehanna, which got up steam and started for New Orleans. We reached New Orleans December 20th, whence I reported fully everything to General Grant, and on the 21st received the following dispatch. Washington, December 211,866. Lieutenant General Sherman, New Orleans. Your telegram of yesterday has been submitted to the President. You are authorized to proceed to St. Louis at your convenience. Your proceedings in the special and delicate duties assigned you are cordially approved by the President and Cabinet and this Department. Edwin M. Stanton. And on the same day, I received this dispatch. Galveston, December 21, 1866, to General Sherman or General Sheridan. Will be in New Orleans tomorrow. Wish to see you both on arrival, on matters of importance. Louis D. Campbell, Minister to Mexico. Mr. Campbell arrived on the 22d, but had nothing to tell of the least importance, save that he was generally disgusted with the whole thing and had not found Juarez at all. I am sure this whole movement was got up for the purpose of getting General Grant away from Washington, on the pretext of his known antagonism to the French occupation of Mexico, because he was looming up as a candidate for president, and nobody understood the animus and purpose better than did Mr. Stanton. He himself was not then on good terms with President Johnson and with several of his associates in the cabinet. By Christmas I was back in St. Louis. By this time, the conflict between President Johnson and Congress had become open and unconcealed. Congress passed the bill known as the Tenure of Civil Office on the 2d of March, 1867, over the President's veto, the first clause of which, now Section 1767 of the Revised Statutes, reads thus. Every person who holds any civil office to which he has been or hereafter may be appointed, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, and who shall have become duly qualified to act therein, shall be entitled to hold such office during the term for which he was appointed, unless sooner removed by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, or by the appointment with the like advice and consent of a successor in his place, except as herein otherwise provided. General E.D. Townsend, in his Anecdotes of the Civil War, states tersely and correctly the preliminary circumstances of which I must treat. He says, on Monday morning, August 5, 1867, President Johnson invited Mr. Stanton to resign as Secretary of War. Under the Tenure of Civil Office law, Mr. Stanton declined. The President a week after suspended him and appointed General Grant, General-in-Chief of the Army, to exercise the functions. This continued until January 13, 1868, when according to the law the Senate passed a resolution not sustaining the President's action. The next morning General Grant came to my office and handed me the key of the Secretary's room, saying, I am to be found over at my office at Army Headquarters. I was served with a copy of the Senate resolution last evening. I then went upstairs and delivered the key of his room to Mr. Stanton. The mode and manner of Mr. Stanton's regaining his office and of General Grant's surrendering it were at the time subjects of bitter controversy. Unhappily, I was involved and must bear testimony. In all January, 1868, I was a member of a board ordered to compile a code of articles of war and army regulations, of which Major General Sheridan and Brigadier General C.C. Augur were associate members. Our place of meeting was in the room of the Old War Department, second floor, next to the corner room occupied by the Secretary of War, with a door of communication. While we were at work, it was common for General Grant and, afterward, for Mr. Stanton to drop in and chat with us on the social gossip of the time. On Saturday, January 11th, General Grant said that he had more carefully read the law Tenure of Civil Office, and it was different from what he had supposed, that in case the Senate did not consent to the removal of Secretary of War Stanton, and he, Grant, should hold on, he should incur a liability of $10,000 and 5 years imprisonment. We all expected the resolution of Senator Howard, of Michigan, virtually restoring Mr. Stanton to his office, would pass the Senate, and knowing that the President expected General Grant to hold on, I inquired if he had given notice of his change of purpose. He answered that there was no hurry, because he supposed Mr. Stanton would pursue toward him, Grant, the same course which he, Stanton, had required of him the preceding August, viz., would address him a letter claiming the office, and allow him a couple of days for the change. Still, he said he would go to the White House the same day and notify the President of his intended action. That afternoon I went over to the White House to present General Pope, who was on a visit to Washington, and we found the President and General Grant together. We made our visit and withdrew, leaving them still together, and I always supposed the subject of this conference was the expected decision of the Senate, which would in effect restore Mr. Stanton to his civil office of Secretary of War. That evening, I dined with the Hun. Reverdy Johnson, senator from Maryland, and suggested to him that the best way to escape a conflict was for the President to nominate some good man as Secretary of War, whose confirmation by the Senate would fall within the provisions of the law, and named General J.D. Cox, then Governor of Ohio, whose term of office was drawing to a close, who would, I knew, be acceptable to General Grant and the Army generally. Mr. Johnson was most favorably impressed with this suggestion, and promised to call on the President the next day, Sunday, which he did, but President Johnson had made up his mind to meet the conflict boldly. I saw General Grant that afternoon at his house on I Street, and told him what I had done, and so anxious was he about it that he came to our room at the War Department the next morning, Monday, the 13th, and asked me to go in person to the White House to urge the President to send in the name of General Cox. I did so, saw the President, and inquired if he had seen Mr. Reverdy Johnson the day before about General Cox. He answered that he had, and thought well of General Cox, but would say no further. Tuesday, January 14, 1868, came, and with it Mr. Stanton. He resumed possession of his former office, came into that where General Sheridan, General Augur, and I were at work, and greeted us very cordially. He said he wanted to see me when at leisure, and at 10:30 a.m. I went into his office and found him and General Grant together. Supposing they had some special matters of business, I withdrew, with the remark that I was close at hand, and could come in at any moment. In the afternoon, I went again into Mr. Stanton's office, and we had a long and most friendly conversation, but not one word was spoken about the tenure of office matter. I then crossed over 17th Street to the headquarters of the Army, where I found General Grant, who expressed himself as by no means pleased with the manner in which Mr. Stanton had regained his office, saying that he had sent a messenger for him that morning as of old, with word that he wanted to see him. We then arranged to meet at his office the next morning at 9:30 and go together to see the President. That morning, the National Intelligencer published an article accusing General Grant of acting in bad faith to the President, and of having prevaricated in making his personal explanation to the Cabinet, so that General Grant at first felt unwilling to go, but we went. The President received us promptly and kindly. Being seated, General Grant said, "Mr. President, whoever gave the facts for the article of the Intelligencer of this morning has made some serious mistakes." The President, "General Grant, let me interrupt you just there. I have not seen the Intelligencer of this morning, and have no knowledge of the contents of any article therein." General Grant then went on, "Well, the idea is given there that I have not kept faith with you. Now, Mr. President, I remember, when you spoke to me on this subject last summer, I did say that, like the case of the Baltimore police commissioners, I did suppose Mr. Stanton could not regain his office except by a process through the courts." To this the President assented, saying he remembered the reference to the case of the Baltimore commissioners, when General Grant resumed. "I said if I changed my opinion I would give you notice, and put things as they were before my appointment as Secretary of War ad interim." We then entered into a general friendly conversation, both parties professing to be satisfied, the President claiming that he had always been most friendly to General Grant, and the latter insisting that he had taken the office, not for honor or profit, but in the general interests of the Army. As we withdrew, at the very door, General Grant said, "Mr. President, you should make some order that we of the Army are not bound to obey the orders of Mr. Stanton as Secretary of War," which the President intimated he would do. No such orders were ever made. Many conferences were held, and the following letters are selected out of a great mass to show the general feeling at the time. 1321 K Street, Washington, January 280, 1868, Saturday. To the President, I neglected this morning to say that I had agreed to go down to Annapolis to spend Sunday with Admiral Porter. General Grant also has to leave for Richmond on Monday morning at 6 a.m. At a conversation with the General after our interview, wherein I offered to go with him on Monday morning to Mr. Stanton, and to say that it was our joint opinion B should resign, it was found impossible by reason of his General Grant going to Richmond and my going to Annapolis. The General proposed this course. He will call on you tomorrow and offer to go to Mr. Stanton to say, for the good of the Army and of the country, he ought to resign. This on Sunday. On Monday I will again call on you, and, if you think it necessary, I will do the same, viz. Go to Mr. Stanton and tell him he should resign. If he will not, then it will be time to contrive ulterior measures. In the meantime, it so happens that no necessity exists for precipitating matters. Yours truly, W. T. Sherman, Lieutenant General. Dear General, on the point of starting, I have written the above and will send a fair copy of it to the President. Please retain this, that in case of necessity, I may have a copy. The President clearly stated to me that he relied on us in this category. Think of the propriety of your putting in writing what you have to say tomorrow, even if you have to put it in the form of a letter to hand him in person, retaining a copy. I'm afraid that acting as a go-between for three persons, I may share the usual fate of meddlers, at last get kinks from all. We ought not to be involved in politics, but for the sake of the Army we are justified in trying at least to cut this Gordian knot, which they do not appear to have any practicable plan to do. In haste as usual. W. T. Sherman. Headquarters Armies of the United States, January 29, 1888. Dear Sherman, I called on the President and Mr. Stanton today, but without any effect. I soon found that to recommend resignation to Mr. Stanton would have no effect, unless it was to incur further his displeasure and, therefore, did not directly suggest it to him. I explained to him, however, the course I supposed he would pursue, and what I expected to do in that case, namely, to notify the President of his intentions, and thus leave him to violate the tenure of office bill, if he chose, instead of having me do it. I would advise that you say nothing to Mr. Stanton on the subject unless he asks your advice. It will do no good and may embarrass you. I did not mention your name to him, at least not in connection with his position or what you thought upon it. All that Mr. Johnson said was pacific and compromising. While I think he wanted the constitutionality of the tenure bill tested, I think now he would be glad either to get the vacancy of Secretary of War or have the office just where it was during suspension. Yours truly. U.S. Grant. Washington, D.C., January 27, 1868. To the President. Dear Sir, as I promised, I saw Mr. Ewing yesterday, and after a long conversation asked him to put down his opinion in writing, which he has done and which I now enclose. I am now at work on these Army regulations, and in the course of preparation have laid down the Constitution and laws now in force, clearer than I find them elsewhere, and beg leave herewith to enclose you 3 pages of printed matter for your perusal. My opinion is, if you will adopt these rules and make them an executive order to General Grant, they will so clearly define the duties of all concerned that no conflict can arise. I hope to get through this task in the course of this week, and want very much to go to St. Louis. For 11 years, I have been tossed about so much that I really do want to rest, study, and make the acquaintance of my family. I do not think, since 1857, I have averaged 30 days out of 365 at home. Next summer also, in fulfillment of our promise to the Sioux, I must go to Fort Phil Kearny early in the spring, so that, unless I can spend the next 2 months at home, I might as well break up my house at St. Louis and give up all prospect of taking care of my family. For these reasons especially I shall soon ask leave to go to St. Louis, to resume my proper and legitimate command. With great respect. W. T. Sherman, Lieutenant General. Washington, D.C., January 25, 1868. My dear General, I am quite clear in the opinion that it is not expedient for the President to take any action now in the case of Stanton. So far as he and his interests are concerned, things are in the best possible condition. Stanton is in the department, got his secretary, but the Secretary of the Senate, who have taken upon themselves his sins, and who place him there under a large salary to annoy and obstruct the operations of the executive. This the people well enough understand, and he is a stench in the nostrils of their own party. I thought the nomination of Cox at the proper juncture would have been wise as a peace offering, but perhaps it would have let off the Senate too easily from the effect of their arbitrary act. Now the dislodging of Stanton and filling the office even temporarily without the consent of the Senate would raise a question as to the legality of the President's acts, and he would belong to the attacked instead of the attacking party. If the war between Congress and the President is to go on, as I suppose it is, Stanton should be ignored by the President, left to perform his clerical duties which the law requires him to perform, and let the party bear the odium which is already upon them for placing him where he is. So much for the President. As to yourself, I wish you as far as possible to keep clear of political complications. I do not think the President will require you to do an act of doubtful legality. Certainly, he will not without sanction of the opinion of his Attorney General, and you should have time, in a questionable case, to consult with me before called upon to act. The office of Secretary of War is a civil office, as completely so as that of Secretary of State, and you as a military officer cannot, I think, be required to assume or exercise it. This may, if necessary, be a subject for further consideration. Such, however, will not, I think, be the case. The appeal is to the people, and it is better for the President to persist in the course he has for some time pursued. Let the aggressions all come from the other side, and I think there is no doubt he will do so. Affectionately T. Ewing. To Lieutenant General Sherman. Library Room, War Department, Washington, D.C., January 31, 1868. To the President. Since our interview of yesterday, I have given the subject of our conversation all my thoughts, and I beg you will pardon my reducing the same to writing. My personal preferences, as expressed, were to be allowed to return to St. Louis to resume my present command, because my command was important, large, suited to my rank and inclination, and because my family was well provided for there in house, facilities, schools, living, and agreeable society. While, on the other hand, Washington was for many, to me, good reasons highly objectionable, especially because it is the political capital of the country, and focus of intrigue, gossip, and slander. Your personal preferences were, as expressed, to make a new department east, adequate to my rank, with headquarters at Washington, and assign me to its command, to remove my family here, and to avail myself of its schools, etc. To remove Mr. Stanton from his office as Secretary of War, and have me to discharge the duties. To effect this removal, two modes were indicated: to simply cause him to quit the War Office building and notify the Treasury Department and the Army Staff Departments no longer to respect him as Secretary of War, or to remove him and submit my name to the Senate for confirmation. Permit me to discuss these points a little, and I will premise by saying that I have spoken to no one on the subject, and have not even seen Mr. Ewing, Mr. Stanbury, or General Grant since I was with you. It has been the rule and custom of our Army, since the organization of the government, that the second officer of the Army should be at the second, in importance, command, and remote from general headquarters. To bring me to Washington world put 3 heads to an army, yourself, General Grant, and myself, and we would be more than human if we were not to differ. In my judgment, it world ruin the Army, and would be fatal to 1 or 2 of us. Generals Scott and Taylor proved themselves soldiers and patriots in the field, but Washington was fatal to both. This city, and the influences that center here, defeated every army that had its headquarters here from 1861 to 1864, and would have overwhelmed General Grant at Spotsylvania and Petersburg, had he not been fortified by a strong reputation, already hard-earned, and because no one then living coveted the place. Whereas, in the West, we made progress from the start, because there was no political capital near enough to poison our minds and kindle into life that craving, itching for fame which has killed more good men than bullets. I have been with General Grant in the midst of death and slaughter when the howls of people reached him after Shiloh. When messengers were speeding to and from his army to Washington, bearing slanders, to induce his removal before he took Vicksburg. In Chattanooga, when the soldiers were stealing the corn of the starving mules to satisfy their own hunger. At Nashville, when he was ordered to the Forlorn Hope, to command the Army of the Potomac, so often defeated, and yet I never saw him more troubled than since he has been in Washington, and been compelled to read himself a sneak and deceiver, based on reports of 4 of the cabinet, and apparently with your knowledge. If this political atmosphere can disturb the equanimity of one so guarded and so prudent as he is, what will be the result with me, so careless, so outspoken as I am? Therefore, with my consent, Washington never. As to the Secretary of War, his office is twofold. As a cabinet officer, he should not be there without your hearty, cheerful assent, and I believe that is the judgment and opinion of every fair-minded man. As the holder of a civil office, having the supervision of moneys appropriated by Congress and of contracts for army supplies, I do think Congress, or the Senate by delegation from Congress, has a lawful right to be consulted. At all events, I would not risk a suit or contest on that phase of the question. The law of Congress, of March 2, 1867, prescribing the manner in which orders and instructions relating to military movements shall reach the Army, gives you as constitutional commander-in-chief the very power you want to exercise, and enables you to prevent the Secretary from making any such orders and instructions. And consequently, he cannot control the Army, but is limited and restricted to a duty that an auditor of the Treasury could perform. You certainly can afford to await the result. The executive power is not weakened, but rather strengthened. Surely, he is not such an obstruction as would warrant violence or even a show of force, which would produce the very reaction and clamor that he hopes for to save him from the absurdity of holding an empty office for the safety of the country. This is so much as I ought to say, and more too, but if it produces the result I will be more than satisfied, viz., that I be simply allowed to resume my proper post and duties in St. Louis. With great respect, yours truly. W. T. Sherman, Lieutenant General. On the 1st of February, the board of which I was the president submitted to the Adjutant General our draft of the Articles of War and Army Regulations, condensed to a small compass, the result of our war experience. But they did not suit the powers that were, and have ever since slept the sleep that knows no waking, to make room for the ponderous document now in vogue, which will not stand the strain of a week's campaign in real war. I hurried back to St. Louis to escape the political storm I saw brewing. The president repeatedly said to me that he wanted me in Washington, and I as often answered that nothing could tempt me to live in that center of intrigue and excitement. But soon came the following. Headquarters Army of the United States, Washington, February 10, 1868. Dear General, I have received at last the President's reply to my last letter. He attempts to substantiate his statements by his cabinet. In this view, it is important that I should have a letter from you, if you are willing to give it, of what I said to you about the effect of the tenure of office bill, and my object in going to see the President on Saturday before the installment of Mr. Stanton. What occurred after the meeting of the Cabinet on the Tuesday following is not a subject under controversy now. Therefore, if you choose to write down your recollection, and I would like to have it, on Wednesday, when you and I called on the President, and your conversation with him the last time you saw him, make that a separate communication. Your order to come east was received several days ago, but the President withdrew it, I suppose to make some alteration, but it has not been returned. Yours truly. U.S. Grant. Washington, D.C., February 18, 1868. Lieutenant General W. T. Sherman, St. Louis. The order is issued ordering you to Atlantic Division. U.S. Grant, General. Headquarters Military Division of the Missouri, St. Louis, February 14, 1868. General U.S. Grant, Washington, D.C. Your dispatch is received informing me that the order for the Atlantic Division has been issued, and that I am assigned to its command. I was in hopes I had escaped the danger, and now were I prepared I should resign on the spot, as it requires no foresight to predict such must be the inevitable result in the end. I will make one more desperate effort by mail, which please await. W. T. Sherman, Lieutenant General. Washington, February 14, 1868. Lieutenant General W. T. Sherman, St. Louis. I think it due to you that your letter of January 31st to the President of the United States should be published, to correct misapprehension in the public mind about your willingness to come to Washington. It will not be published against your will. Sent in cipher. Headquarters Military Division of the Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri, February 14, 1868. General U.S. Grant, Washington, D.C. Dispatch of today received. Please await a letter I address this day through you to the President, which will in due time reach the public, covering the very point you make. I don't want to come to Washington at all. W. T. Sherman, Lieutenant General. Headquarters Military Division of the Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri, February 14, 1868. Hun, John Sherman, United States Senate, Washington, D.C. Oppose confirmation of myself as Brevet General on ground that it is unprecedented, and that it is better not to extend the system of brevets above Major General. If I can't avoid coming to Washington, I may have to resign. W. T. Sherman, Lieutenant General. Headquarters of the Army, Washington, D.C., February 12, 1868. The following orders are published for the information and guidance of all concerned. U.S. Grant, General. Executive Mansion, Washington, D.C., February 12, 1868. General, you will please issue an order creating a military division to be styled the Military Division of the Atlantic, to be composed of the Department of the Lakes, the Department of the East, and the Department of Washington, to be commanded by Lieutenant General W. T. Sherman, with his headquarters at Washington. Until further orders from the President, you will assign no officer to the permanent command of the Military Division of the Missouri. Respectfully yours, Andrew Johnson. General U.S. Grant, Commanding Armies of the United States, Washington, D.C. Major General P. H. Sheridan, the senior officer in the Military Division of the Missouri, will temporarily perform the duties of Commander of the Military Division of the Missouri in addition to his duties of Department Commander. By command of General Grant. E. D. Townsend, Assistant Adjutant General. This order, if carried into effect, would have grouped in Washington: 1. The President, Constitutional Commander-in-Chief. 2. The Secretary of War, Congressional Commander-in-Chief. 3. The General of the Armies of the United States. 4. The Lieutenant General of the Army. 5. The Commanding General of the Department of Washington. 6. The Commander of the Post of Washington. At that date, the garrison of Washington was a brigade of infantry and a battery of artillery. I never doubted Mr. Johnson's sincerity in wishing to befriend me, but this was the broadest kind of a farce, or meant mischief. I therefore appealed to him by letter to allow me to remain where I was, and where I could do service, real service, and received his most satisfactory answer. Headquarters Military Division of the Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri, February 14, 1868. General U.S. Grant, Washington, D.C. Dear General, last evening, just before leaving my office, I received your note of the 10th and had intended answering it according to your request. But after I got home, I got your dispatch of yesterday, announcing that the order I dreaded so much was issued. I never felt so troubled in my life. Were it an order to go to Sitka, to the devil, to battle with rebels or Indians, I think you would not hear a whimper from me, but it comes in such a questionable form that, like Hamlet's ghost, it curdles my blood and mars my judgment. My first thoughts were of resignation, and I had almost made up my mind to ask Dodge for some place on the Pacific Road or on one of the Iowa roads, and then again various colleges ran through my memory. But hard times and an expensive family have brought me back to staring the proposition square in the face, and I have just written a letter to the President, which I herewith transmit through you, on which I will hang a hope of respite till you telegraph me its effect. The uncertainties ahead are too great to warrant my incurring the expense of breaking up my house and family here, and therefore in no event will I do this till I can be assured of some permanence elsewhere. If it were at all certain that you would accept the nomination of president in May, I would try and kill the intervening time, and then judge of the chances, but I do not want you to reveal your plans to me till you choose to do so. I have telegraphed to John Sherman to oppose the nomination, which the papers announce has been made of me for brevet general. I have this minute received your cipher dispatch of today, which I have just answered and sent down to the telegraph office, and the clerk is just engaged in copying my letter to the president to go with this. If the president or his friends pretend that I seek to go to Washington, it will be fully rebutted by letters I have written to the president, to you, to John Sherman, to Mr. Ewing, and to Mr. Stanbury. You remember that in our last talk you suggested I should write again to the president. I thought of it and concluded my letter of January 31st, already delivered, was full and emphatic. Still, I did write again to Mr. Stanbury, asking him as a friend to interpose in my behalf. There are plenty of people who know my wishes, and I would avoid, if possible, the publication of a letter so confidential as that of January 31st, in which I notice I allude to the President's purpose of removing Mr. Stanton by force, a fact that ought not to be drawn out through me, if it be possible to avoid it. In the letter herewith I confine myself to purely private matters, and will not object if it reaches the public in any proper way. My opinion is, the President thinks Mrs. Sherman would like to come to Washington by reason of her father and brothers being there. This is true, for Mrs. Sherman has an idea that St. Louis is unhealthy for our children, and because most of the Catholics here are tainted with the old secesh feeling. But I know better what is to our common interest, and prefer to judge of the proprieties myself. What I do object to is the false position I would occupy as between you and the President. Were there an actual army at or near Washington, I could be withdrawn from the most unpleasant attitude of a go-between. But there is no army there, nor any military duties which you with a host of subordinates cannot perform. Therefore I would be there with naked, informal, and sinecure duties, and utterly out of place. This you understand well enough, and the army too, but the President and the politicians, who flatter themselves they are saving the country, cannot and will not understand. My opinion is, the country is doctored to death, and if President and Congress would go to sleep like Rip Van Winkle, the country would go on under natural influences, and recover far faster than under their joint and several treatment. This doctrine would be accounted by Congress, and by the President too, as high treason, and therefore I don't care about saying so to either of them. But I know you can hear anything, and give it just what thought or action it merits. Excuse this long letter, and telegraph me the result of my letter to the President as early as you can. If he holds my letter so long as to make it improper for me to await his answer, also telegraph me. The order, when received, will, I suppose, direct me as to whom and how I am to turn over this command, which should, in my judgment, not be broken up, as the 3 departments composing the division should be under one head. I expect my staff officers to be making for me within the hour to learn their fate, so advise me all you can as quick as possible. With great respect, yours truly, W. T. Sherman, Lieutenant General. To the President. Dear Sir, it is hard for me to conceive you would purposely do me an unkindness unless under the pressure of a sense of public duty, or because you do not believe me sincere. I was in hopes, since my letter to you of the 31st of January, that you had concluded to pass over that purpose of yours expressed more than once in conversation to organize a new command for me in the East, with headquarters in Washington. But a telegram from General Grant of yesterday says that the order was issued ordering you, me, to Atlantic Division. And the newspapers of this morning contain the same information, with the addition that I have been nominated as Brevet General. I have telegraphed my own brother in the Senate to oppose my confirmation, on the ground that the 2 higher grades in the Army ought not to be complicated with brevets, and I trust you will conceive my motives aright. If I could see my way clear to maintain my family, I should not hesitate a moment to resign my present commission, and seek some business wherein I would be free from these unhappy complications that seem to be closing about me, spite of my earnest efforts to avoid them. But necessity ties my hands, and I must submit with the best grace I can till I make other arrangements. In Washington are already the headquarters of a department and of the Army itself, and it is hard for me to see wherein I can render military service there. Any staff officer with the rank of major could surely fill any gap left between these two military officers, and by being placed in Washington, I will be universally construed as a rival to the General-in-Chief, a position damaging to me in the highest degree. Our relations have always been most confidential and friendly, and if, unhappily, any cloud of differences should arise between us, my sense of personal dignity and duty would leave me no alternative but resignation. For this I am not yet prepared, but I shall proceed to arrange for it as rapidly as possible, so that when the time does come, as it surely will if this plan is carried into effect, I may act promptly. Inasmuch as the order is now issued, I cannot expect a full revocation of it, but I beg the privilege of taking post at New York, or any point you may name within the new military division other than Washington. This privilege is generally granted to all military commanders, and I see no good reason why I too may not ask for it, and this simple concession, involving no public interest, will much soften the blow, which, right or wrong, I construe as one of the hardest I have sustained in a life somewhat checkered with adversity. With great respects, yours truly, W. T. Sherman, Lieutenant General. Washington, D.C., 2 p.m., February 19, 1888. Lieutenant General W. T. Sherman, St. Louis, Missouri. I have just received, with General Grant's endorsement of reference, your letter to me of the 14th inst. The order to which you refer was made in good faith, and with a view to the best interests of the country and the service. As, however, your assignment to a new military division seems so objectionable, you will retain your present command. Andrew Johnson. On that same 19th of February, he appointed Adjutant General Lorenzo Thomas to be Secretary of War ad interim, which finally resulted in the articles of impeachment and trial of President Johnson before the Senate. I was a witness on that trial, but of course the lawyers would not allow me to express any opinion of the President's motives or intentions, and restricted me to the facts set forth in the articles of impeachment, of which I was glad to know nothing. The final test vote revealed less than 2/3, and the President was consequently acquitted. Mr. Stanton resigned. General Schofield, previously nominated, was confirmed as Secretary of War, thus putting an end to what ought never to have happened at all. Indian Peace Commission. On the 20th of July, 1867, President Johnson approved an act to establish peace with certain hostile Indian tribes, the first section of which reads as follows: Be it enacted, etc., that the President of the United States be and is hereby authorized to appoint a commission to consist of three officers of the Army not below the rank of Brigadier General, who, together with N.G. Taylor, Commissioner of Indian Affairs, John B. Henderson, Chairman of the Committee of Indian Affairs of the Senate, S.F. Tappan, and John B. Sanborn, shall have power and authority to call together the chiefs and headmen of such bands or tribes of Indians as are now waging war against the United States, or committing depredations on the people thereof, to ascertain the alleged reasons for their acts of hostility, and in their discretion, under the direction of the President, to make and conclude with said bands or tribes such treaty stipulations, subject to the action of the Senate, as may remove all just causes of complaint on their part, and at the same time establish security for person and property along the lines of railroad now being constructed to the Pacific and other thoroughfares of travel to the Western Territories, and such as will most likely ensure civilization for the Indians and peace and safety for the whites. The President named as the military members Lieutenant General Sherman, Brigadier Generals A. H. Terry and W. S. Harney. Subsequently, to ensure a full attendance, Brigadier General C. C. Augur was added to the commission, and his name will be found on most of the treaties. The commissioners met at St. Louis and elected N.G. Taylor, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, President, J.B. Sanborn, Treasurer, and A.S.H. White, Esquire of Washington, D.C., Secretary. The year 1867 was too far advanced to complete the task assigned during that season, and it was agreed that a steamboat, St. John's, should be chartered to convey the commission up the Missouri River, and we adjourned to meet at Omaha. In the St. John's, the commission proceeded up the Missouri River, holding informal talks with the Santees at their agency near the Niobrara, the Yanktonites at Fort Thompson, and the Ogalallas, Minneconjous, Sans Arcs, etc. at Fort Sully. From this point, runners were sent out to the Sioux occupying the country west of the Missouri River to meet us in council at the Forks of the Platte that fall, and to Sitting Bull's band of outlaw Sioux and the Crows on the Upper Yellowstone to meet us in May 1868 at Fort Laramie. We proceeded up the river to the mouth of the Cheyenne and turned back to Omaha, having ample time on this steamboat to discuss and deliberate on the problems submitted to our charge. We all agreed that the nomad Indians should be removed from the vicinity of the two great railroads then in rapid construction, and be localized on one or other of the two great reservations south of Kansas and north of Nebraska. That agreements, not treaties, should be made for their liberal maintenance as to food, clothing, schools, and farming implements for 10 years, during which time we believed that these Indians should become self-supporting. To the north, we proposed to remove the various bands of Sioux, with such others as could be induced to locate near them. And to the south on the Indian territory already established, we proposed to remove the Cheyennes, Arapahoes, Kiowas, Comanches, and such others as we could prevail on to move thither. At that date, the Union Pacific construction had reached the Rocky Mountains at Cheyenne and the Kansas Pacific to about Fort Wallace. We held council with the Ogalallas at the Forks of the Platte and arranged to meet them all the next spring, 1868. In the spring of 1868, we met the Crows in council at Fort Laramie, the Sioux at the North Platte, the Shoshones or Snakes at Fort Hall, the Navajos at Fort Sumner, on the Pecos, and the Cheyennes and Arapahoes at Medicine Lodge. To accomplish these results, the commission divided up into committees, General Augur going to the Shoshones, Mr. Tappan and I to the Navajos, and the remainder to Medicine Lodge. In that year, we made treaties or arrangements with all the tribes which before had followed the buffalo in their annual migrations, and which brought them into constant conflict with the whites. Mr. Tappan and I found it impossible to prevail on the Navajos to remove to the Indian Territory, and had to consent to their return to their former home, restricted to a limited reservation west of Santa Fe, about Old Fort Defiance, and there they continue unto this day, rich in the possession of herds of sheep and goats, with some cattle and horses, and they have remained at peace ever since. A part of our general plan was to organize the two great reservations into regular territorial governments, with governor, council, courts, and civil officers. General Harney was temporarily assigned to that of the Sioux at the north, and General Hazen to that of the Kiowas, Comanches, Cheyennes, Arapahoes, etc., at the south, but the patronage of the Indian Bureau was too strong for us, and that part of our labor failed. Still, the Indian Peace Commission of 1867-68 did prepare the way for the great Pacific railroads, which, for better or worse, have settled the fate of the buffalo and Indian forever. There have been wars and conflicts since with these Indians up to a recent period too numerous and complicated in their detail for me to unravel and record, but they have been the dying struggles of a singular race of brave men fighting against destiny, each less and less violent. Till now the wild game is gone, the whites too numerous and powerful, so that the Indian question has become one of sentiment and charity, but not of war. The peace, or Quaker policy, of which so much has been said, originated about thus. By the Act of Congress, approved March 3, 1869, the 45 regiments of infantry were reduced to 25, and provision was made for the muster out of many of the surplus officers, and for retaining others to be absorbed by the usual promotions and casualties. On the 7th of May of that year, by authority of an Act of Congress approved June 30, 1834, 9 field officers and 59 captains and subalterns were detached and ordered to report to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, to serve as Indian superintendents and agents. Thus, by an old law surplus army officers were made to displace the usual civil appointees, undoubtedly a change for the better, but most distasteful to members of Congress, who looked to these appointments as part of their proper patronage. The consequence was the law of July 15, 1870, which vacated the military commission of any officer who accepted or exercised the functions of a civil officer. I was then told that certain politicians called on President Grant, informing him that this law was chiefly designed to prevent his using Army officers for Indian agents, civil offices, which he believed to be both judicious and wise. Army officers, as a rule, being better qualified to deal with Indians than the average political appointees. The president then quietly replied, "Gentlemen, you have defeated my plan of Indian management, but you shall not succeed in your purpose, for I will divide these appointments up among the religious churches, with which you dare not contend." The army officers were consequently relieved of their civil offices, and the Indian agencies were apportioned to the several religious churches in about the proportion of their supposed strength, some to the Quakers, some to the Methodists, to the Catholics, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, etc., etc., and thus it remains to the present time, these religious communities selecting the agents to be appointed by the Secretary of the Interior. The Quakers, being first named, gave name to the policy, and it is called the Quaker policy today. Meantime, railroads and settlements by hardy, bold pioneers have made the character of Indian agents of small concern, and it matters little who are the beneficiaries. As was clearly foreseen, General U.S. Grant was duly nominated, and on the 7th of November, 1868, was elected President of the United States for the 4 years beginning with March 4, 1869. On the 15th and 16th of December, 1868, the 4 societies of the armies of the Cumberland, Tennessee, Ohio, and Georgia held a joint reunion at Chicago, at which were present over 2,000 of the surviving officers and soldiers of the war. The ceremonies consisted of the joint meeting in Crosby's magnificent opera house, at which General George H. Thomas presided. General W. W. Belknap was the orator for the Army of the Tennessee, General Charles Cruft for the Army of the Cumberland, General J. D. Cox for the Army of the Ohio, and General William Cogswell for the Army of Georgia. The banquet was held in the vast Chamber of Commerce, at which I presided. General Grant, President-elect, General J. M. Schofield, Secretary of War, General H. W. Slocum, and nearly every general officer of note was present except General Sheridan, who at the moment was fighting the Cheyennes in southern Kansas and the Indian Country. At that time, we discussed the Army changes which would necessarily occur in the following March, and it was generally understood that I was to succeed General Grant as General-in-Chief. But as to my successor, Meade, Thomas, and Sheridan were candidates. And here, I will remark that General Grant, afterward famous as the Silent Man, used to be very gossipy, and no one was ever more fond than he of telling anecdotes of our West Point and early Army life. At the Chicago reunion, he told me that I would have to come to Washington, that he wanted me to effect a change as to the general staff, which he had long contemplated, and which was outlined in his letter to Mr. Stanton of January 291,866, given hereafter, which had been repeatedly published and was well known to the military world. That on being inaugurated president on the 4th of March, he would retain General Schofield as his Secretary of War until the change had become habitual. That the modern custom of the Secretary of War giving military orders to the Adjutant General and other staff officers was positively wrong and should be stopped. Speaking of General Grant's personal characteristics at that period of his life, I recall a conversation in his carriage when, riding down Pennsylvania Avenue, he inquired of me in a humorous way, "Sherman, what special hobby do you intend to adopt?" I inquired what he meant, and he explained that all men had their special weakness or vanity, and that it was wiser to choose one's own than to leave the newspapers to affix one less acceptable, and that for his part he had chosen the horse, so that when anyone tried to pump him, he would turn the conversation to his horse. I answered that I would stick to the theater and balls, for I was always fond of seeing young people happy, and did actually acquire a reputation for dancing, though I had not attempted the waltz or anything more than the ordinary cotilin since the war. On the 24th of February, 1869, I was summoned to Washington, arriving on the 26th, taking along my aides, Lieutenant Colonels Dayton and Audenried. On the 4th of March, General Grant was duly inaugurated President of the United States, and I was nominated and confirmed as General of the Army. Major General P.H. Sheridan was at the same time nominated and confirmed as Lieutenant General, with orders to command the military division of the Missouri, which he did, moving the headquarters from St. Louis to Chicago, and General Meade was assigned to command the military division of the Atlantic, with headquarters at Philadelphia. At that moment, General Meade was in Atlanta, Georgia, commanding the 3rd Military District under the Reconstruction Act, and General Thomas, whose post was in Nashville, was in Washington on a court of inquiry investigating certain allegations against General A. B. Dyer, Chief of Ordnance. He occupied the room of the 2nd floor in the building on the corner of H and 15th Streets, since become Wormley's Hotel. I, at the time, was staying with my brother, Senator Sherman, at his residence, 1321 K Street, and it was my habit each morning to stop at Thomas's room on my way to the office in the War Department to tell him the military news, and to talk over matters of common interest. We had been intimately associated as man and boy for 30-odd years, and I profess to have had better opportunities to know him than any man then living. His fame as the Rock of Chickamauga was perfect, and by the world at large he was considered as the embodiment of strength, calmness, and imperturbability. Yet of all my acquaintances, Thomas worried and fretted over what he construed neglects or acts of favoritism more than any other. At that time, he was much worried by what he supposed was injustice in the promotion of General Sheridan, and still more that General Meade should have an Eastern station, which compelled him to remain at Nashville or go to the Pacific. General Thomas claimed that all his life he had been stationed in the South or remote West, and had not had a fair share of Eastern posts, whereas that General Meade had always been there. I tried to get him to go with me to see President Grant and talk the matter over frankly, but he would not, and I had to act as a friendly mediator. General Grant assured me at the time that he not only admired and respected General Thomas, but actually loved him as a man, and he authorized me in making up commands for the general officers to do anything and everything to favor him, only he could not recede from his former action in respect to Generals Sheridan and Meade. Prior to General Grant's inauguration, the Army Register showed as Major Generals Halleck, Meade, Sheridan, Thomas, and Hancock. Therefore, the promotion of General Sheridan to be Lieutenant General did not overslaw Thomas, but it did Meade and Halleck. The latter did not expect promotion. General Meade did, but was partially, not wholly, reconciled by being stationed at Philadelphia, the home of his family. And President Grant assured me that he knew of his own knowledge that General Sheridan had been nominated Major General before General Meade, but had waived dates out of respect for his age and longer service, and that he had nominated him as Lieutenant General by reason of his special fitness to command the military division of the Missouri, embracing all the wild Indians, at that very moment in a state of hostility. I gave General Thomas the choice of every other command in the Army, and of his own choice he went to San Francisco, California, where he died March 28, 1870. The truth is, Congress should have provided by law for 3 lieutenant generals for these 3 preeminent soldiers, and should have dated their commissions with Gettysburg, Winchester, and Nashville. It would have been a graceful act, and might have prolonged the lives of 2 most popular officers, who died soon after, feeling that they had experienced ingratitude and neglect. Soon after General Grant's inauguration as president, and, as I supposed, in fulfillment of his plan divulged in Chicago the previous December, were made the following. Headquarters of the Army, Washington, March 8, 1869. General Orders, No. 11. The following orders of the President of the United States are published for the information and government of all concerned. War Department, Washington City, March 5, 1869. By direction of the President, General William T. Sherman will assume command of the Army of the United States. The Chiefs of Staff Corps, departments, and bureaus will report to and act under the immediate orders of the General commanding the Army. Any official business which by law or regulation requires the action of the President or Secretary of War will be submitted by the General of the Army to the Secretary of War. And in general, all orders from the President or Secretary of War to any portion of the Army, line, or staff will be transmitted through the General of the Army. J. M. Schofield, Secretary of War. by command of the General of the Army. E.D. Townsend, Assistant Adjutant General. On the same day, I issued my General Orders No. 12, assuming command and naming all the heads of staff departments and bureaus as members of my staff, adding to my then 3 aides, Colonels McCoy, Dayton, and Audenried, the names of Colonels Comstock, Horace Porter, and Dent, agreeing with President Grant that the 2 latter could remain with him till I should need their personal services or ask their resignations. I was soon made aware that the heads of several of the staff corps were restive under this new order of things, for by long usage they had grown to believe themselves not officers of the Army in a technical sense, but a part of the War Department, the civil branch of the government which connects the Army with the President and Congress. In a short time, General John A. Rawlins, General Grant's former Chief of Staff, was nominated and confirmed as Secretary of War, and soon appeared this order. Headquarters of the Army. Adjutant General's Office, Washington, March 27, 1869. General Orders No. 28. The following orders received for the War Department are published for the government of all concerned. War Department, Washington City, March 26, 1869. By direction of the President, the order of the Secretary of War, dated War Department, March 5, 1869, and published in General Orders No. 11, Headquarters of the Army, Adjutant General's Office, dated March 8, 1869, except so much as directs General W.T. Sherman to assume command of the Army of the United States, is hereby rescinded. All official business which by law or regulations requires the action of the President or Secretary of War will be submitted by the Chiefs of Staff Corps, departments, and bureaus to the Secretary of War. All orders and instructions relating to military operations issued by the President or Secretary of War will be issued through the General of the Army. John A. Rawlins, Secretary of War. By command of General Sherman. E.D. Townsend, Assistant Adjutant General. Thus we were thrown back on the old method in having a double if not a treble-headed machine. Each head of a bureau in daily consultation with the Secretary of War, and the General to command without an adjutant, quartermaster, commissary, or any staff except his own aides, often reading in the newspapers of military events and orders before he could be consulted or informed. This was the very reverse of what General Grant, after 4 years' experience in Washington as General-in-Chief, seemed to want, different from what he had explained to me in Chicago, and totally different from the demand he had made on Secretary of War Stanton in his complete letter of January 29, 1866. I went to him to know the cause. He said he had been informed by members of Congress that his action, as defined by his order of March 5th, was regarded as a violation of laws making provision for the bureaus of the War Department, that he had repealed his own orders, but not mine, and that he had no doubt that General Rawlins and I could draw the line of separation satisfactorily to us both. General Rawlins was very conscientious, but a very sick man when appointed Secretary of War. Several times he made orders through the Adjutant General to individuals of the Army without notifying me, but always when his attention was called to it he apologized, and repeatedly said to me that he understood from his experience on General Grant's staff how almost insulting it was for orders to go to individuals of a regiment, brigade, division, or an army of any kind, without the commanding officer being consulted or even advised. This habit is more common at Washington than any place on earth, unless it be in London, where nearly the same condition of facts exists. Members of Congress daily appeal to the Secretary of War for the discharge of some soldier on the application of a mother, or some young officer has to be dry-nursed, withdrawn from his company on the plains to be stationed near home. The Secretary of War, sometimes moved by private reasons, or more likely to oblige the member of Congress, grants the order, of which the commanding general knows nothing till he reads it in the newspapers. Also, an Indian tribe goaded by the pressure of white neighbors breaks out in revolt. The General-in-Chief must reinforce the local garrisons not only with men, but horses, wagons, ammunition, and food. All the necessary information is in the staff bureaus in Washington, but the general has no right to call for it, and generally finds it more practicable to ask by telegraph of the distant division or department commanders for the information before making the formal orders. The general in actual command of the army should have a full staff, subject to his own command. If not, he cannot be held responsible for results. General Rawlins sank away visibly, rapidly, and died in Washington, September 60, 1869, and I was appointed to perform the duties of his office till a successor could be selected. I realized how much easier and better it was to have both offices conjoined. The Army then had one constitutional commander-in-chief of both Army and Navy, and one actual commanding general, bringing all parts into real harmony. An army to be useful must be a unit, and out of this has grown the saying, attributed to Napoleon, but doubtless spoken before the days of Alexander, that an army with an inefficient commander was better than one with two able heads. Our political system and methods, however, demanded a separate Secretary of War, and in October President Grant asked me to scan the list of the volunteer generals of good record who had served in the Civil War, preferably from the West. I did so, and submitted to him in writing the names of W. W. Belknap, of Iowa, G. M. Dodge, the chief engineer of the Union Pacific Railroad, and Lucius Fairchild of Madison, Wisconsin. I also named General John W. Sprague, then employed by the Northern Pacific Railroad in Washington Territory. General Grant knew them all personally, and said if General Dodge were not connected with the Union Pacific Railroad, with which the Secretary of War must necessarily have large transactions, he would choose him. But as the case stood, and remembering the very excellent speech made by General Belknap at the Chicago reunion of December, 1868, he authorized me to communicate with him to ascertain if he were willing to come to Washington as Secretary of War. General Belknap was then the Collector of Internal Revenue at Keokuk, Iowa. I telegraphed him and received a prompt and favorable answer. His name was sent to the Senate, promptly confirmed, and he entered on his duties October 251,869. General Belknap surely had at that date as fair a fame as any officer of volunteers of my personal acquaintance. He took up the business where it was left off, and gradually fell into the current which led to the command of the Army itself, as of the legal and financial matters which properly pertain to the War Department. Orders granting leaves of absence to officers, transfers, discharges of soldiers for favor, and all the old abuses, which had embittered the life of General Scott in the days of Secretaries of War Marcy and Davis, were renewed. I called his attention to these facts, but without sensible effect. My office was under his in the old War Department, and one day I sent my aide-de-camp, Colonel Audenried, up to him with some message, and when he returned red as a beet, very much agitated, he asked me as a personal favor never again to send him to General Belknap. I inquired his reason, and he explained that he had been treated with a rudeness and discourtesy he had never seen displayed by any officer to a soldier. Colonel Audenried was one of the most polished gentlemen in the Army, noted for his personal bearing and deportment, and I had some trouble to impress on him the patience necessary for the occasion, but I promised on future occasions to send some other or go myself. Things went on from bad to worse till in 1870 I received from Mr. Hugh Campbell, of St. Louis, a personal friend and an honorable gentleman, a telegraphic message complaining that I had removed from his position Mr. Ward, post-trader at Fort Laramie, with only a month in which to dispose of his large stock of goods, to make room for his successor. It so happened that we of the Indian Peace Commission had been much indebted to this same trader, Ward, for advances of flour, sugar, and coffee to provide for the Crow Indians, who had come down from their reservation on the Yellowstone to meet us in 1868, before our own supplies had been received. For a time I could not comprehend the nature of Mr. Campbell's complaint, so I telegraphed to the department commander, General C. C. Auger, at Omaha, to know if any such occurrence had happened and the reasons therefor. I received a prompt answer that it was substantially true and had been ordered by the Secretary of War. It so happened that during General Grant's command of the Army, Congress had given to the General of the Army the appointment of post-traders. He had naturally devolved it on the subordinate division and department commanders, but the legal power remained with the General of the Army. I went up to the Secretary of War, showed him the telegraphic correspondence, and pointed out the existing law in the revised statutes. General Belknap was visibly taken aback and explained that he had supposed the right of appointment rested with him, that Ward was an old rebel Democrat, etc., whereas Ward had been in fact the sutler of Fort Laramie, a United States military post, throughout the Civil War. I told him that I should revoke his orders and leave the matter where it belonged, to the local council of administration and commanding officers. Ward was unanimously re-elected and reinstated. He remained the trader of the post until Congress repealed the law and gave back the power of appointment to the Secretary of War, when of course he had to go. But meantime, he was able to make the necessary business arrangements, which saved him and his partners the sacrifice which would have been necessary in the first instance. I never had any knowledge whatever of General Belknap's transactions with the traders at Fort Sill and Fort Lincoln, which resulted in his downfall. I have never sought to ascertain his motives for breaking with me, because he knew I had always befriended him while under my military command, and in securing him his office of Secretary of War. I spoke frequently to President Grant of the growing tendency of his Secretary of War to usurp all the powers of the commanding general, which would surely result in driving me away. He has frequently promised to bring us together to agree upon a just line of separation of our respective offices, but never did. Determined to bring the matter to an issue, I wrote the following letter. Headquarters Army of the United States, Washington, D.C., August 17, 1870. General W. W. Belknap, Secretary of War. General, I must urgently and respectfully invite your attention, when at leisure, to a matter of deep interest to future commanding generals of the Army more than to myself, of the imperative necessity of fixing and clearly defining the limits of the powers and duties of the General of the Army, or of whomsoever may succeed to the place of Commander-in-Chief. The case is well stated by General Grant in his letter of January 29, 1866, to the Secretary of War, Mr. Stanton, hereto appended. And though I find no official answer recorded, I remember that General Grant told me that the Secretary of War had promptly assured him in conversation that he fully approved of his views as expressed in this letter. At that time, the subject was much discussed, and soon after Congress enacted the bill reviving the grade of general, which bill was approved July 25, 1866, and provided that the general, when commissioned, may be authorized under the direction and during the pleasure of the President to command the armies of the United States. And a few days after, viz., July 28, 1866, was enacted the law which defined the military peace establishment. The enacting clause reads, that the military peace establishment of the United States shall hereafter consist of 5 regiments of artillery, 10 regiments of cavalry, 45 regiments of infantry, the professors and corps of cadets of the United States Military Academy, and such other forces as shall be provided for by this act, to be known as the Army of the United States. The act then recites in great detail all the parts of the Army, making no distinction between the line and staff, but clearly makes each and every part an element of the whole. Section 37 provides for a board to revise the Army regulations and report, and declares that the regulations then in force, viz., those of 1863, should remain until Congress shall act on said report. And Section 38 and last enacts that all laws and parts of laws inconsistent with the provisions of this Act be, and the same are hereby repealed. Under the provisions of this law, my predecessor, General Grant, did not hesitate to command and make orders to all parts of the Army, the military academy, and staff. And it was under his advice that the new regulations were compiled in 1868 that drew the line more clearly between the high and responsible duties of the Secretary of War and the General of the Army. He assured me many a time before I was called here to succeed him that he wanted me to perfect the distinction. And it was by his express orders that on assuming the command of the Army, I specifically placed the heads of the staff corps here in Washington in the exact relation to the Army which they would bear to an army in the field. I am aware that subsequently, in his orders of March 26th, he modified his former orders of March 5th, but only as to the heads of bureaus in Washington, who have, he told me, certain functions of office imposed on them by special laws of Congress, which laws, of course, override all orders and regulations. But I did not either understand from him in person or from General Rawlins, at whose instance this order was made, that it was designed in any way to modify, alter, or change his purposes that division and department commanders, as well as the general of the army, should exercise the same command of the staff as they did of the line of the army. I need not remind the Secretary that orders and reports are made to and from the military academy, which the general does not even see, though the military academy is specifically named as a part of that army which he is required to command. Leaves of absence are granted, the stations of officers are changed, and other orders are now made directly to the army, not through the general, but direct through other officials and the adjutant general. So long as this is the case, I surely do not command the Army of the United States, and am not responsible for it. I am aware that the confusion results from the fact that the 37th section of the Act of July 28, 1866, clothes the Army Regulations of 1863 with the sanction of law. But the next section repeals all laws and parts of laws inconsistent with the provisions of this Act. The Regulations of 1863 are but a compilation of orders made prior to the war, when such men as Davis and Floyd took pleasure in stripping General Scott of even the semblance of power, and purposely reduced him to a cipher in the command of the army. Not one word can be found in those regulations speaking of the duties of the lieutenant general commanding the army, or defining a single act of authority rightfully devolving on him. Not a single mention is made of the rights and duties of a commander-in-chief of the army. He is ignored, and purposely, too, as a part of the program resulting in the rebellion, that the army without a legitimate head should pass into the anarchy which these men were shaping for the whole country. I invite your attention to the Army Regulations of 1847, when our best soldiers lived, among whom was your own father, and see paragraphs 48 and 49, page 8, and they are so important that I quote them entire. 48. The military establishment is placed under the orders of the Major General Commanding-in-Chief in all that regards its discipline and military control. Its fiscal arrangements properly belong to the administrative departments of the staff and to the Treasury Department under the direction of the Secretary of War. 49. The General of the Army will watch over the economy of the service in all that relates to the expenditure of money, supply of arms, ordnance and ordnance stores, clothing, equipments, camp equipage, medical and hospital stores, barracks, quarters, transportation, military academy, pay, and subsistence. In short, everything which enters into the expenses of the military establishment, whether personal or material. He will also see that the estimates for the military service are based on proper data, and made for the objects contemplated by law and necessary to the due support and useful employment of the army. In carrying into effect these important duties, he will call to his counsel and assistance the staff, and those officers proper, in his opinion, to be employed in verifying and inspecting all the objects which may require attention. The rules and regulations established for the government of the army and the laws relating to the military establishment are the guides to the commanding general in the performance of his duties. Why was this, or why was all mention of any field of duty for the head of the army left out of the Army Regulations? Simply because Jefferson Davis had a purpose and absorbed to himself, as Secretary of War, as General Grant well says, all the powers of Commander-in-Chief. Floyd succeeded him, and the last regulations of 1863 were but a new compilation of their orders, hastily collected and published to supply a vast army with a new edition. I contend that all parts of these regulations inconsistent with the law of July 28, 1866, are repealed. I surely do not ask for any power myself, but I hope and trust, now when we have a military president and a military secretary of war, that in the new regulations to be laid before Congress next session, the functions and duties of the Commander-in-Chief will be so clearly marked out and defined that they may be understood by himself and the Army at large. I am, with great respect, your obedient servant. W. T. Sherman, General. Washington, January 29, 1866. Hun, E. M. Stanton, Secretary of War. From the period of the difficulties between Major General, now Lieutenant General, Scott, with Secretary Marcy, during the administration of President Polk. The command of the army virtually passed into the hands of the Secretary of War. From that day to the breaking out of the rebellion, the General-in-Chief never kept his headquarters in Washington, and could not, consequently, with propriety resume his proper functions. To administer the affairs of the army properly, headquarters and the Adjutant General's office must be in the same place. During the war, while in the field, my functions as commander of all the armies was never impaired, but were facilitated in all essential matters by the administration and by the War Department. Now, however, that the war is over and I have brought my headquarters to the city, I find my present position embarrassing and I think out of place. I have been intending, or did intend, to make the beginning of the new year the time to bring this matter before you, with the view of asking to have the old condition of affairs restored, but from diffidence about mentioning the matter have delayed. In a few words, I will state what I conceive to be my duties and my place, and ask respectfully to be restored to them and it. The entire Adjutant General's office should be under the entire control of the General-in-Chief of the Army. No orders should go to the Army or the Adjutant General except through the General-in-Chief. Such as require the action of the President would be laid before the Secretary of War, whose actions would be regarded as those of the President. In short, in my opinion, the General-in-Chief stands between the President and the Army in all official matters, and the Secretary of War is between the Army, through the General-in-Chief, and the President. I can very well conceive that a rule so long disregarded could not, or would not, be restored without the subject being presented, and I now do so respectfully for your consideration. U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. General Belknap never answered that letter. In August 1870 was held at Des Moines, Iowa, an encampment of old soldiers which I attended, en route to the Pacific, and at Omaha received this letter. Long Branch, New Jersey, August 180, 1870. General W. T. Sherman. Dear General, your letter of the 7th inst. Did not reach Long Branch until after I had left for St. Louis, and consequently is just before me for the first time. I do not know what changes recent laws, particularly the last Army bill passed, make in the relations between the General of the Army and the Secretary of War. Not having this law or other statutes here, I cannot examine the subject now, nor would I want to without consultation with the Secretary of War. On our return to Washington, I have no doubt but that the relations between the Secretary and yourself can be made pleasant, and the duties of each be so clearly defined as to leave no doubt where the authority of one leaves off and the other commences. My own views, when commanding the Army, were that orders to the Army should go through the General. No changes should be made, however, either of the location of troops or officers, without the knowledge of the Secretary of War. In peace, the General commanded them without reporting to the Secretary farther than he chose the specific orders he gave from time to time, but subjected himself to orders from the Secretary, the latter deriving his authority to give orders from the President. As Congress has the right, however, to make rules and regulations for the government of the Army, rules made by them, whether they are as they should be or not, will have to govern. As before stated, I have not examined the recent law. Yours truly, U.S. Grant. To which I replied, Omaha, Nebraska, September 21,870. General U.S. Grant, Washington, D.C. Dear General, I have received your most acceptable letter of August 18th and assure you that I am perfectly willing to abide by any decision you may make. We had a most enthusiastic meeting at Des Moines, and General Belknap gave us a fine, finished address. I have concluded to go over to San Francisco to attend the annual celebration of the Pioneers, to be held on the 9th instant. From there, I will make a short tour, aiming to get back to St. Louis by the 1st of October, and so on to Washington without unnecessary delay. Conscious of the heavy burdens already on you, I should refrain from adding 1 ounce to your load of care. But it seems to me now is the time to fix clearly and plainly the field of duty for the Secretary of War and the Commanding General of the Army, so that we may escape the unpleasant controversy that gave so much scandal in General Scott's time and leave to our successors a clear field. No matter what the result, I promise to submit to whatever decision you may make. I also feel certain that General Belknap thinks he is simply executing the law as it now stands, but I am equally certain that he does not interpret the law reviving the grade of general, and that fixing the peace establishment of 1868 as I construe them. For instance, I am supposed to control the discipline of the military academy as a part of the army, whereas General Belknap ordered a court of inquiry in the case of the colored cadet, made the detail, reviewed the proceedings, and made his order without my knowing a word of it, except through the newspapers. And more recently, when I went to Chicago to attend to some division business, I found the Inspector General, Hardy, under orders from the Secretary of War to go to Montana on some claim business. All I ask is that such orders should go through me. If all the staff officers are subject to receive orders direct from the Secretary of War, it will surely clash with the orders they may be in the act of executing from me or from their immediate commanders. I ask that General Belknap draw up some clear, well-defined rules for my action, that he show them to me before publication, that I make on them my remarks, and then that you make a final decision. I promise faithfully to abide by it or give up my commission. Please show this to General Belknap, and I will be back early in October. With great respect, your friend, W.T. Sherman. I did return about October 15th, saw President Grant, who said nothing had been done in the premises, but that he would bring General Belknap and me together and settle this matter. Matters went along pretty much as usual till the month of August, 1871, when I dined at the Arlington with Admiral Alder and General Belknap. The former said he had been promoted to Rear Admiral and appointed to command the European squadron, then at Villafranca, near Nice, and that he was going out in the frigate Wabash, inviting me to go along. I had never been to Europe, and the opportunity was too tempting to refuse. After some preliminaries, I agreed to go along, taking with me as aide-de-camp Colonel Audenried and Lieutenant Fred Grant. The Wabash was being overhauled at the Navy Yard at Boston, and was not ready to sail till November, when she came to New York, where we all embarked Saturday, November 11th. I have very full notes of the whole trip, and here need only state that we went out to the island of Madeira, and thence to Cadiz and Gibraltar. Here my party landed, and the Wabash went on to Villafranca. From Gibraltar, we made the general tour of Spain to Bordeaux, through the south of France to Marseille, Toulon, etc. to Nice, from which place we rejoined the Wabash and brought ashore our baggage. From Nice we went to Genoa, Turin, the Mont Cenis Tunnel, Milan, Venice, etc. to Rome. Thence to Naples, Messina, and Syracuse, where we took a steamer to Malta. From Malta to Egypt and Constantinople, to Sebastopol, Poti, and Tiflis. At Constantinople and Sebastopol, my party was increased by Governor Curtin, his son, and Mr. McGahan. It was my purpose to have reached the Caspian and taken boats to the Volga, and up that river as far as navigation would permit, but we were dissuaded by the Grand Duke Michael, Governor-General of the Caucasus, and took carriages 600 miles to Taganrog, on the Sea of Azov, to which point the railroad system of Russia was completed. From Taganrog, we took cars to Moscow and St. Petersburg. Here Mr. Curtin and party remained, he being our minister at that court. Also Fred Grant left us to visit his aunt at Copenhagen. Colonel Audenried and I then completed the tour of interior Europe, taking in Warsaw, Berlin, Vienna, Switzerland, France, England, Scotland, and Ireland, embarking for home in the good steamer Baltic, Saturday, September 7, 1872, reaching Washington, D.C., September 22d. I refrain from dwelling on this trip because it would swell this chapter beyond my purpose. When I regained my office, I found matters unchanged since my departure, the Secretary of War exercising all the functions of Commander-in-Chief, and I determined to allow things to run to their necessary conclusion. In 1873, my daughter Minnie also made a trip to Europe, and I resolved as soon as she returned that I would simply move back to St. Louis to execute my office there as best I could. But I was embarrassed by being the possessor of a large piece of property in Washington on I Street, near the corner of 3rd, which I could at the time neither sell nor give away. It came into my possession as a gift from friends in New York and Boston, who had purchased it of General Grant and transferred to me at the price of $65,000. The house was very large, costly to light, heat, and maintain, and Congress had reduced my pay $4,000 or $5,000 a year so that I was gradually being impoverished. Taxes, too, grew annually from about $400 a year to $1,500, besides all sorts of special taxes. Finding myself caught in a dilemma, I added a new hall and made out of it 2 houses, one of which I occupied and the other I rented, and thus matters stood in 1873-74. By the agency of Mr. Hall, a neighbor and broker, I effected a sale of the property to the present owner, Mr. Emery, at a fair price, accepting about half payment in notes and the other half in a piece of property on E Street, which I afterward exchanged for a place in Sight Brilliant, a suburb of St. Louis, which I still own. Being thus footloose, and having repeatedly notified President Grant of my purpose, I wrote the Secretary of War on the 8th day of May, 1874, asking the authority of the President and the War Department to remove my headquarters to St. Louis. On the 11th day of May, General Belknap replied that I had the assent of the President and himself, enclosing the rough draft of an order to accomplish this result, which I answered on the 15th, expressing my entire satisfaction, only requesting delay in the publication of the orders till August or September, as I preferred to make the changes in the month of October. On the 3d of September, these orders were made. War Department, Adjutant General's Office, Washington, September 8, 1874. General Orders, No. 108. With the assent of the President, and at the request of the General, the headquarters of the armies of the United States will be established at St. Louis, Missouri, in the month of October next. The regulations and orders now governing the functions of the General of the Army, and those in relation to transactions of business with the War Department and its bureaus, will continue in force. By order of the Secretary of War. E.D. Townsend, Adjutant General. Our daughter Minnie was married October 1, 1874, to Thomas W. Fitch, United States Navy, and we all forthwith packed up and regained our own house at St. Louis, taking an office on the corner of 10th and Locust Streets. The only staff I brought with me were the aides allowed by law, and though we went through the forms of command, I realized that it was a farce, and it did not need a prophet to foretell it would end in a tragedy. We made ourselves very comfortable, made many pleasant excursions into the interior, had a large correspondence, and escaped the mortification of being slighted by men in Washington who were using their temporary power for selfish ends. Early in March, 1676, appeared in all the newspapers of the day the sensational report from Washington that Secretary of War Belknap had been detected in selling sutlerships in the Army, that he had confessed it to Representative Blackburn of Kentucky, that he had tendered his resignation, which had been accepted by the President, and that he was still subject to impeachment, would be impeached and tried by the Senate. I was surprised to learn that General Belknap was dishonest in money matters, for I believed him a brave soldier, and I sorely thought him honest. But the truth was soon revealed from Washington, and very soon after I received from Judge Alphonso Taft, of Cincinnati, a letter informing me that he had been appointed Secretary of War and should insist on my immediate return to Washington. I answered that I was ready to go to Washington or anywhere if assured of decent treatment. I proceeded to Washington when, on the 6th of April, were published these orders. General Orders, No. 28. The following orders of the President of the United States are hereby promulgated for the information and guidance of all concerned. The headquarters of the Army are hereby reestablished at Washington City, and all orders and instructions relative to military operations or affecting the military control and discipline of the Army issued by the President through the Secretary of War shall be promulgated through the General of the Army, and the departments of the Adjutant General and the Inspector General shall report to him and be under his control in all matters relating thereto. By order of the Secretary of War. E.D. Townsend, Adjutant General. This was all I had ever asked. Accordingly, my personal staff were brought back to Washington, where we resumed our old places. Only I did not, for some time, bring back the family, and then only to a rented house on 15th Street, which we occupied till we left Washington for good. During the period from 1876 to 1884, we had as Secretaries of War in succession the Huns: Alphonso Taft, J.D. Cameron, George W. McCrary, Alexander Ramsey, and R.T. Lincoln, with each and all of whom I was on terms of the most intimate and friendly relations. And here I will record of Washington that I saw it, under the magic hand of Alexander R. Shepard, grow from a straggling, ill-paved city to one of the cleanest, most beautiful and attractive cities of the whole world. Its climate is salubrious, with as much sunshine as any city of America. The country immediately about it is naturally beautiful and romantic, especially up the Potomac, in the region of the Great Falls. And, though the soil be poor as compared with that of my present home, it is susceptible of easy improvement and embellishment. The social advantages cannot be surpassed even in London, Paris, or Vienna. And among the resident population, the members of the Supreme Court, Senate, House of Representatives, Army, Navy, and the several executive departments may be found an intellectual class one cannot encounter in our commercial and manufacturing cities. The student may, without tax and without price, have access, in the libraries of Congress and of the several departments, to books of every nature and kind. And the museums of natural history are rapidly approaching a standard of comparison with the best of the world. Yet it is the usual and proper center of political intrigue, from which the army especially should keep aloof, because the army must be true and faithful to the powers that be, and not be subjected to a temptation to favor one or other of the great parties into which our people have divided, and will continue to divide, it may be, with advantage to the whole. It would be a labor of love for me, in this connection, to pay a tribute of respect, by name, to the many able and most patriotic officers with whom I was so long associated as the commanding generals of military divisions and departments, as well as staff officers. But I must forego the temptation, because of the magnitude of the subject, certain that each and all of them will find biographers better posted and more capable than myself. And I would also like to make recognition of the hundreds of acts of most graceful hospitality on the part of the officers and families at our remote military posts in the days of the adobe, the jacal, and dugout, when a board floor and a shingle roof were luxuries expected by none except the commanding officer. I can see, in memory, a beautiful young city-bred lady who had married a poor second lieutenant and followed him to his post on the plains, whose quarters were in a dugout 10 feet by about 15, 7 feet high, with a dirt roof. 4 feet of the walls were the natural earth, the other 3 of sod, with holes for windows and corn sacks for curtains. This little lady had her Saratoga trunk, which was the chief article of furniture. Yet, by means of a rug on the ground floor, a few candle boxes covered with red cotton calico for seats, a table improvised out of a barrel head, and a fireplace and chimney excavated in the back wall or bank, she had transformed her hole in the ground into a most attractive home for her young warrior husband. And she entertained me with a supper consisting of the best of coffee, fried ham, cakes, and jellies from the commissary, which made on my mind an impression more lasting than have any one of the hundreds of magnificent banquets I have since attended in the palaces and mansions of our own and foreign lands. Still more would I like to go over again the many magnificent trips made across the interior plains, mountains, and deserts before the days of the completed Pacific Railroad, with regular Doughertys, drawn by 4 smart mules, one soldier with carbine or loaded musket in hand seated alongside the driver, 2 in the back seat with loaded rifles swung in the loops made for them, the lightest kind of baggage, and generally a bag of oats to supplement the grass, and to attach the mules to their camp. With an outfit of 2, 3, or 4 of such, I have made journeys of as much as 1,800 miles in a single season, usually from post to post, averaging in distance about 200 miles a week. With as much regularity as is done today by the steam car, it's 500 miles a day. But those days are gone, and, though I recognize the great national advantages of the more rapid locomotion, I cannot help occasionally regretting the change. One instance in 1866 rises in my memory, which I must record. Returning eastward from Fort Garland, we ascended the Rocky Mountains to the Sangre de Cristo Pass. The road descending the mountain was very rough and sidling. I got out with my rifle and walked ahead about 4 miles, where I awaited my Doherty. After an hour or so, I saw, coming down the road, a wagon, and did not recognize it as my own till quite near. It had been upset, the top all mashed in, and no means at hand for repairs. I consequently turned aside from the main road to a camp of cavalry near the Spanish Peaks, where we were most hospitably received by Major A and his accomplished wife. They occupied a large hospital tent, which about a dozen beautiful greyhounds were free to enter at will. The ambulance was repaired, and the next morning we renewed our journey, escorted by the Major and his wife on their fine saddle horses. They accompanied us about 10 miles of the way, and, though age has since begun to tell on them, I shall ever remember them in their pride and strength as they galloped alongside our wagons down the long slopes of the Spanish Peaks in a driving snowstorm. And yet again would it be a pleasant task to recall the many banquets and feasts of the various associations of officers and soldiers, who had fought the good battles of the Civil War, in which I shared as a guest or host, when we could indulge in a reasonable amount of glorification at deeds done and recorded, with wit, humor, and song, these when memory was fresh, and when the old soldiers were made welcome to the best of cheer and applause in every city and town of the land. But no. I must hurry to my conclusion, for this journey has already been sufficiently prolonged. I had always intended to divide time with my natural successor, General P.H. Sheridan, and early notified him that I should about the year 1884 retire from the command of the army, leaving him about an equal period of time for the highest office in the army. It so happened that Congress had meantime, by successive enactments, cut down the army to 25,000 men, the usual strength of a corps d'armée, the legitimate command of a lieutenant general. Up to 1882, officers not disabled by wounds or sickness could only avail themselves of the privileges of retirement on application, after 30 years of service, at 62 years of age. But on the 30th of June, 1882, a bill was passed which, by operation of the law itself, compulsorily retired all Army officers, regardless of rank, at the age of 64 years. At the time this law was debated in Congress, I was consulted by senators and others in the most friendly manner, representing that, if I wanted it, an exception could justly and easily be made in favor of the general and lieutenant general, whose commissions expired with their lives. But I invariably replied that I did not ask or expect an exception in my case, because no one could know or realize when his own mental and physical powers began to decline. I remembered well the experience of Gil Blas with the Bishop of Granada, and favored the passage of the law fixing a positive period for retirement to obviate in the future special cases of injustice, such as I had seen in the recent past. The law was passed, and every officer then knew the very day on which he must retire, and could make his preparations accordingly. In my own case, the law was liberal in the extreme, being without reduction in his current pay and allowances. I would be 64 years old on the 8th of February, 1884, a date inconvenient to move and not suited to other incidents. So I resolved to retire on the first day of November, 1883, to resume my former home at St. Louis and give my successor ample time to meet the incoming Congress. But preliminary thereto, I concluded to make one more tour of the continent, going out to the Pacific by the northern route and returning by that of the 35th parallel. This we accomplished, beginning at Buffalo, June 21st, and ending at St. Louis, Missouri, September 30, 1883, a full and most excellent account of which can be found in Colonel Tidball's diary, which forms part of the report of the General of the Army for the year 1883. Before retiring also, as was my duty, I desired that my aides-de-camp who had been so faithful and true to me should not suffer by my act. All were to retain the rank of colonels of cavalry till the last day, February 8, 1884, but meantime each secured places as follows. Colonel O. M. Poe was Lieutenant Colonel of the Engineer Corps, United States Army, and was by his own choice assigned to Detroit in charge of the engineering works on the Upper Lakes, which duty was most congenial to him. Colonel J. C. Tidball was assigned to command the artillery school at Fort Monroe, by virtue of his commission as Lieutenant Colonel 3rd Artillery, a station for which he was specially qualified. Colonel John E. Tourtelot was then entitled to promotion to Major of the 7th Cavalry, a rank in which he could be certain of an honorable command. The only remaining aide-de-camp was Colonel John M. Bacon, who utterly ignored self in his personal attachment to me. He was then a captain of the 9th Cavalry, but with almost a certainty of promotion to be Major of the 7th before the date of my official retirement, which actually resulted. The last two accompanied me to St. Louis and remained with me to the end. Having previously accomplished the removal of my family to St. Louis, and having completed my last journey to the Pacific, I wrote the following letter. Headquarters Army United States, Washington, D.C., October 8, 1883. Hun, R.T. Lincoln, Secretary of War. Sir, by the Act of Congress, approved June 30, 1882, all Army officers are retired on reaching the age of 64 years. If living, I will attain that age on the 8th day of February, 1884. But as that period of the year is not suited for the changes necessary on my retirement, I have contemplated anticipating the event by several months, to enable the President to meet these changes at a more convenient season of the year, and also to enable my successor to be in office before the assembling of the next Congress. I therefore request authority to turn over the command of the Army to Lieutenant General Sheridan on the 1st day of November, 1883, and that I be ordered to my home at St. Louis, Missouri, there to await the date of my legal retirement. And inasmuch as for a long time I must have much correspondence about war and official matters, I also ask the favor to have with me for a time my two present aides-de-camp, Colonels J. E. Tortolot and J. M. Bacon. The others of my personal staff, viz., Colonels O. M. Poe and J. C. Tidball, have already been assigned to appropriate duties in their own branches of the military service, the engineers and artillery. All should retain the rank and pay as aides-de-camp until February 1884. By or before the 1st day of November I can complete all official reports, and believe I can surrender the Army to my successor in good shape and condition, well provided in all respects, and distributed for the best interests of the country. I am grateful that my physical and mental strength remain unimpaired by years, and am thankful for the liberal provision made by Congress for my remaining years, which will enable me to respond promptly to any call the President may make for my military service or judgment as long as I live. I have the honor to be your obedient servant. W. T. Sherman, General. The answer was, War Department, Washington City, October 10, 1888. General W. T. Sherman, Washington, D.C. General, I have submitted to the President your letter of the 8th instant, requesting that you be relieved of the command of the Army on the 1st of November next, as a more convenient time for making the changes in military commands which must follow your retirement from active service, than would be the date of your retirement under the law. In signifying his approval of your request, the President directs me to express to you his earnest hope that there may be given you many years of health and happiness in which to enjoy the gratitude of your fellow citizens, well earned by your most distinguished public services. It will give me pleasure to comply with your wishes respecting your aides-de-camp, and the necessary orders will be duly issued. I have the honor to be, General, your obedient servant, Robert T. Lincoln, Secretary of War. On the 27th day of October, I submitted to the Secretary of War, the Hun. R. T. Lincoln, my last annual report, embracing among other valuable matters the most interesting and condensed report of Colonel O. M. Poe, A.D.C., of the original conception, progress, and completion of the 4 great transcontinental railways, which have in my judgment done more for the subjugation and civilization of the Indians than all other causes combined, and have made possible the utilization of the vast area of pasture lands and mineral regions which before were almost inaccessible, for my agency in which I feel as much pride as for my share in any of the battles in which I took part. Promptly on the 1st of November were made the following general orders, and the command of the Army of the United States passed from me to Lieutenant General P. H. Sheridan, with as little ceremony as would attend the succession of the lieutenant colonel of a regiment to his colonel about to take a leave of absence. Headquarters of the Army, Washington, November 1, 1885. General Orders Number 77. By and with the consent of the President, as contained in General Orders Number 71 of October 13, 1883, the undersigned relinquishes command of the Army of the United States. In thus severing relations which have hitherto existed between us, he thanks all officers and men for their fidelity to the high trust imposed on them during his official life, and will, in his retirement, watch with parental solicitude their progress upward in the noble profession to which they have devoted their lives. W. T. Sherman, General. Official, R. C. Drum, Adjutant General. Headquarters of the Army, Washington, November 1, 1885. General Orders Number 78. In obedience to orders of the President, promulgated in General Orders Number 71, October 13, 1883, from these headquarters, the undersigned hereby assumes command of the Army of the United States. P. H. Sheridan, Lieutenant General. Official, R.C. Drum, Adjutant General. After a few days in which to complete my social visits, and after a short visit to my daughter, Mrs. A. M. Thakara, at Philadelphia, I quietly departed for St. Louis. And, as I hope, for good and all, the family was again reunited in the same place from which we were driven by a cruel, unnecessary civil war initiated in Charleston Harbor in April, 1861. On the 8th day of February, 1884, I was 64 years of age, and therefore retired by the operation of the Act of Congress approved June 30, 1882. But the fact was gracefully noticed by President Arthur in the following General Orders. War Department, Adjutant General's Office, Washington, February 8, 1984. The following order of the President is published to the Army. Executive Mansion, February 8, 1884. General William T. Sherman, General of the Army, having this day reached the age of 64 years, is, in accordance with the law, placed upon the retired list of the Army, without reduction in his current pay and allowances. The announcement of the severance from the command of the Army of one who has been for so many years its distinguished chief can but awaken in the minds, not only of the Army, but of the people of the United States, mingled emotions of regret and gratitude at the withdrawal from active military service of an officer whose lofty sense of duty has been a model for all soldiers since he first entered the Army in July, 1840. And gratitude, freshly awakened, for the services of incalculable value rendered by him in the war for the Union, which his great military genius and daring did so much to end. The President deems this a fitting occasion to give expression, in this manner, to the gratitude felt toward General Sherman by his fellow citizens, and to the hope that Providence may grant him many years of health and happiness in the relief from the active duties of his profession. By order of the Secretary of War. Chester A. Arthur. R. C. Drum, Adjutant General. To which I replied. St. Louis, February 9, 1884. His Excellency Chester A. Arthur, President of the United States. Dear Sir, permit me with a soldier's frankness to thank you personally for the handsome compliment bestowed in General Orders of yesterday, which are reported in the journals of the day. To me, it was a surprise and a most agreeable one. I had supposed the actual date of my retirement would form a short paragraph in the common series of special orders of the War Department. But as the honored executive of our country has made it the occasion for his own hand to pen a tribute of respect and affection to an officer passing from the active stage of life to one of ease and rest, I can only say I feel highly honored and congratulate myself in thus rounding out my record of service in a manner most gratifying to my family and friends. Not only this, but I feel sure, when the orders of yesterday are read on parade to the regiments and garrisons of the United States, many a young hero will tighten his belt and resolve anew to be brave and true to the starry flag, which we of our day have carried safely through one epoch of danger, but which may yet be subjected to other trials, which may demand similar sacrifices, equal fidelity and courage, and a larger measure of intelligence. Again, thanking you for so marked a compliment, and reciprocating the kind wishes for the future. I am, with profound respect, your friend and servant, W. T. Sherman, General. This I construe as the end of my military career. In looking back upon the past, I can only say, with millions of others, that I have done many things I should not have done, and have left undone still more which ought to have been done. That I can see where hundreds of opportunities have been neglected, but on the whole am content, and feel sure that I can travel this broad country of ours, and be each night the welcome guest in palace or cabin, and as all the world's stage, and all the men and women merely players. I claim the privilege to ring down the curtain. W. T. Sherman, General.